Herodotus is credited as the oldest surviving historian. Although his histories focus on how ancient Greece managed to survive against the Persian Empire, these military events merely serve as the backdrop for a great variety of cultural, political, and geographic descriptions. From how ancient Athens became a democracy to how Egyptian sailors rounded the whole of Africa and much more. Aside from an overall analysis, on this video you will find a detailed summary for each of his books. Analysis and critique of Herodotus' Histories. In Herodotus' Histories, there are two prevalent explanatory causes to history, that is, two things that bring about historical change or occurrences. One is divine power, the other is human psychology. Aside from outlining how these causes manifest themselves in Herodotus' writing, mentions must be made to his geographic descriptions and considerations, his plethora of socio-cultural examples and descriptions, his moralizations, and, lastly, as with any historian, his biases and commendable impartialities. As for what is meant by divine power as an explanatory cause, I should make clear that Herodotus is far from a theologian or fundamentalist. In fact, he at most only hints or suggests the possibility of divine intervention. He proposes it, voices belief in it, but unless it is regarding something trivial, he also provides more material explanations. In fact, the main references to divine intervention are mentions, often digressions, about the predictions of the Oracle of Delphi. He certainly shows great faith in the oracle's veracity, but in these cases, the oracle merely predicts, rather than cause, the occurrences of history. Nonetheless, the historian does propose crediting divinities like Pan for the Athenian victory at Marathon, the likes of Poseidon for destroying much of the Persian fleet while sparing the Greek, and Demeter for taking vengeance on the barbarians' lack of civility in the prior destruction of one of her temples. Most curious or jocular is the description on how Apollo himself, by way of thunder, saved the oracle from the hands of the Persians. Yet, once again, it should be clear that these things are often merely a possible factor and only arguably, not explicitly, the cause of history. Furthermore, at least in the case of the oracle avoiding the barbarians, it is clear, as all historians ever, he must have been under external pressure to relate a story that would be accepted, agreed upon, by the audience. Given the prior, human agency, or the forces of psychology, should be taken as Herodotus' main historical interpretation, historical force. Though arguably this occurs in conjunction or tangential to his moral judgments, nonetheless there is often nothing besides an individual's vices and virtues as the explanation for why whole populations behaved the way they did. These explanations range from Darius' invasion of Scythia because of his desire to surpass the fame of a past Egyptian pharaoh, not to mention how out of shame his wife made a deadly deal with a Greek doctor, to Cambyses' invasion of Egypt for little less than being denied the Egyptian woman he lusted for. Of course, the prior type of explanation is most easily asserted when it comes to the actions of individuals, such as kings. Yet, believe it or not, the main portion of Herodotus' histories is not focused on such individuals, if at all. Yes, let the prior segue into his geographical concerns, and then his socio-cultural exemplifications. The historian essentially describes the whole world map as it was then known. He does this both in a general sense, but also with specific inquiries that are often outright treatises on natural philosophy. Take for example his explanation on the various theories of why the Nile River ebbs and grows as it does, or why the Egyptian skulls appeared to him, upon testing cadavers, to be stronger than usual. His geographic references range from the natural fauna to disputes on how the continents should be grouped or divided. As might be imagined, often, he ends up speaking of lands at the edge of the map. As such, these lands, he says, seem to contain the most fantastical and bizarre kinds of individuals. Yet, he does admit, jocularly, how these claims are in all likelihood a result of ignorance and tale. In fact, he is so judicious in his rationality, all the while maintaining a religious outlook, that at one point he expresses what amounts to the theory of evolution as it is commonly misunderstood by contemporary dilettantes. To get details on that, one must watch the videos. As for the peoples of the world he describes, it should be known that from the very beginning Herodotus declares his intentions of laying any preference or presupposed value of importance on any specific group. His reasoning being that as in human affairs the only thing that does not change is the very fact that things change. Therefore he, a historian, should not ignore the currently insignificant or overemphasize the currently important. This reasoning leads him to reference and describe diverse societies. Likewise occurs with the cultural practices. These include things from the Egyptian practice of circumcision, the divinities of various cultures, the treatment of women, and even the treatment of slaves. Of the latter two, the historian must be credited for both commending womanhood as capable and not necessarily inferior to men, and for advocating for at least a humane treatment of slaves. Of the former, the quintessential examples would be his descriptions of a pair of Babylonian queens and the queen from his hometown named Artemisia. Of the latter, he not only commends a Persian law protecting slaves from mistreatment, but also a tale against the practice of castrating slaves. Switching to a mention of his moralizations and possible biases, it should be noted that Herodotus attributes the highest value to philosophy, in particular a philosophy of temperance and humbleness. This is evinced by his high opinion of the likes of Solon and Aristides. As he is with philosophy, so too is he against tyranny and in favor of democracy. Yes, the historian describes monarchy as a jocular barbarian institution. As such, he has a certain amount of disdain for all non-Greeks. Regarding democracy, he not only seems to love Athens, but often casts some offenses towards the Spartans, especially their monarchy. That is not to say that Herodotus is one to ignore potential flaws in democracy. Yet, it would be very hard to argue that he does not consider it more praiseworthy. Despite all the aforementioned, the present historian does give some credit, some laudation, to barbarians. He believes that the Greeks inherited religion from barbarians. Likewise, with some sports and certain military tools. The most significant sign of Herodotus's awareness of the subjectivity necessary for appropriate cultural valuations is a story regarding Indian ceremonial practices. This story segues or concludes with Pindar's famous observation, an observation that all historians, sociologists, psychologists, anthropologists, philosophers in a general sense, must always keep in mind. Custom is king. I always end my videos with at least one aphorism that I crafted from or as a result of the reading. Therefore, I figure it would only be proper to include some of the yet-to-be-mentioned aphorisms in this final video. For the sake of brevity, I will only include 5. Either way, if you haven't, make sure to watch the 12 videos outlining the 9 books of Herodotus' Histories.
Although the wishing are many, and the willing are few, the capable are scarcest. Happiness from self-indulgence not only makes an individual's life short in duration, but also a species' existence ephemeral. Since luck has it that idiocy may triumph over intellect, audacity is either astute or rash regardless of whether it succeeds. That happiness is ever merely, but transient and never lasting, lends weight to the idea that life is but a dream that the deity besets on the judgment of whom will wake. Only the fool or the slave is unwilling to barter with death.
The first book, called Clio, Part 1 of 2, Introduction and the Fall of Croesus. Herodotus begins his work by describing the mythology of the conflicts between the West and East, between the Hellenes and the Eastern barbarians. He says that the well-known Persians allege that it all began with the Phoenicians. The first of the offenses, as the historian calls it, concerns yes, the same mythological figure that features in Aeschylus's Prometheus Bound. Unfortunately, her story is too vast, as there are too many alternate versions for me to retell. The historian merely mentions her in passing. It is fabled that she was taken by the Phoenicians, and that is how she ends up in Egypt, where she is transformed back from a cow into a human. The second offense was perpetrated by the Greeks, in part as a response to the former. A group of Greeks take some Phoenician princesses. Never mind the details. The significant consideration is that the rape, the stealing of women, is an element that repeats through many of the myth stories. The historian does not bother with as much detail as he seemingly could. Instead, he announces his methodology or intention, as he says,
"I shall go forward further with the story, giving an account of the cities of men, small as well as great. For those which in old times were great have for the most part become small, while those that were in my own time great used in former times to be small. So then, since I know that human prosperity never continues steadfast, I shall make mention of both indifferently."
This, of course, is most commendable and astute. It is important to keep in mind that a historian cannot be entirely certain as to what is of value, as one never knows what will ensue after the history is written. Now Herodotus gets into more verifiable history as he discusses the fate, the humbling fortune of Croesus. The historian credits him as being the first Easterner, though in my interpretation not a savage barbarian that subdues any Greek city. First, the genealogy that led to Croesus' rule is described. Apparently, a certain, far, descendant of Heracles is involved. The latter was named Candace. This man, being very proud of his wife's beauty, allowed his servant or companion to see his wife's naked body. This was supposed to be done in secret. The motivation behind such a deed is that
It happens that men's ears are less apt of belief than their eyes.
Obviously, though this notion is well known, there is an aphorism in here. Either way, the wife notices the ploy and chooses to punish her husband. Herodotus describes that the barbarians are humiliated by their own naked body. She tells the man who saw her naked that he must either kill Candace or die himself. Of course, the man kills the descendant of Heracles and assumes the throne. Curiously, and let this be the first show of Herodotus' religious style, though there might be an earlier example, the Oracle of Delphi announces that vengeance for the Heraclidae will come within 5 generations. The historian tells various stories or anecdotes that occur leading up to Croesus, the 5th generation. Among these stories is a mention of Periander. He was a then famous, but now little known, possibly enlightened, monarch of Corinth. Allow me to skip the details of the story. It is related or connects with a treatise by the historian-philosopher named Plutarch. I mention it to let you know that on this channel you may also learn about Plutarch's writings. After invading the Greek cities in Asia Minor, present-day Turkey, Croesus considers invading the Aegean Islands. Yet, Bias, the ancient wise man, convinced him against the endeavor. I should mention that at this time, all of the 7 wise men are featuring. This, of course, segues into a mention of Solon. This wise man arrives at Croesus' court after reforming the government of Athens and instituting the, at least, first steps towards democracy. Then, the most noteworthy and memorable of events ensue. After showing Solon all his wealth, luxury, comfort, and dominion, Croesus asked the wise man,
"Whether thou hast seen any whom thou deemest to be of all men the most happy?" But Solon, using no flattery but the truth only, said, "Yes, O king, Telos the Athenian."
Solon then explains that what makes Telos worthy of such a status is the fact that he died happy and with positive renown. Thus, Croesus asked, supposing still that he himself would be the answer, who would be happiest besides the previously mentioned man. Yet, to Croesus' frustration, Solon answered Cleobus and Biton. These men are from a sure myth, but Solon and Herodotus, and even Plutarch in another treatise, take them as true. They are the ones who, after being kind and helpful sons to their mother, the priestess of a temple to Hera, and their mother praying to the goddess for the greatest blessing, reward, possible to be granted to her helpful children, are granted a peaceful death. Yes, although young and healthy, they go to sleep never to wake up, proof that, alas, death is better than life. Croesus, of course, did not like any of this. Solon explains to him the dimensions of life, the length of life. This is something that truly must be thought or realized by all at some point in life. Of course, some might never realize it. The wise man then says,
Man is altogether a creature of accident. Before he comes to his end, it is well to hold back and not to call him yet happy, but only fortunate. But we must of everything examine the end and how it will turn out at the last, for too many God shows but a glimpse of happiness and then plucks them up by the roots and overturns them.
As is well known, and I think Herodotus returns to it later, Solon leaves, and eventually returns to Athens. In the meantime, Croesus has merely received a foreboding of his upcoming trials and misfortunes. First, Croesus dreams that one of his children will die young. Since his other child seems to have had some sort of mental deficiency, the king decides to remove his healthy child from all dangers. Yet, to make a long story short, despite his best efforts, his healthy child is killed in an accident. This is but the beginning of the monarch's misfortunes as he becomes ambitious to, instead of invading Greece as previously mentioned, invade Persia, the then small and weak Persian kingdom. Croesus reaches this decision by misinterpreting the prophecy of the oracle of Delphi. The oracle famously tells him that if he marches against the Persians, he will destroy a great empire. Croesus figures this means he will destroy the Persians. Alas, it meant he will destroy his own empire. LOL. The topic changes to how Pisistratus came to control Athens. This involved faking an injury from some unspecified enemies and thus obtaining permission to keep armed guards within the city's walls. The soon-to-be tyrant then used these guards to take over the Acropolis and declare himself king. Of course, this was but the first time he did such a thing, for he was soon after deposed, all to take power again. On the second occasion, says the historian, the tyrant applied
a device the most simple by far, as I think, that ever was practiced. Considering at least that it was devised at a time when the Hellenic race had been long marked off from the barbarian as more skillful and further removed from foolish simplicity, and among the Athenians who are accounted the first of the Hellenes in ability.
This jocular frustration or derision refers to the fact that Pisistratus dressed a tall, beautiful woman as Athena and had her ride with him in a chariot into the city, while companions alongside yelled that the goddess herself was bringing the man to rule Athens. The tyrant loses power once again, in part because his young wife accuses him of refusing to have sex with her. He abstains from sex or from conventional sex, because marriage to the woman was due to a necessary political link, and he already had a child he wished to bestow the city to. Regardless, despite losing the prior political connections, he manages to take control of the city for a third time. This time he applies force, military action. Herodotus then does as before, but now regarding Sparta. Specifically, with how the city came to have its system of laws and the situation it found itself in when Croesus allied with them in preparation with the war against the Persians. To make a long story short, the Spartans, in desperation and difficulty, gave Lycurgus power to reform the whole system of life. The present historian says that this happened during a war against Tegea. Then, believe it or not, the remains, the bones, of none other than Orestes are involved. This is the hero who killed his own mother as described by the playwright Aeschylus, whose plays you may also learn about on this channel. For now, never mind the details about that. As previously mentioned, Croesus allies with the Spartans, but invades Persia without asking them for assistance. The historian describes the whole campaign which, of course, Croesus loses against the Persian king, Cyrus. As the former is retreating, he sends for the Spartans, but as these are caught in a conflict of their own, by the time the Spartans are ready to send support, Medea, the Lydian capital, had fallen and Croesus was already captured. As to me, the most interesting portion of Croesus' story is how he learned Solon's lesson. Let me mention that a certain prophetess had divined that Croesus should not wish for his yet living son to regain his wit, in particular his ability to speak, as that would be a day of woe. It happened that the son who never spoke shouted out when enemy soldiers were about to kill his father. This let them know that their victim was the enemy king, and instead of quickly murdering him, they captured him to be burned alive. Yet, Croesus did not die, rather, Herodotus relates.
As he stood upon the pyre there came, Although he was in such evil case, a memory of the saying of Solon, how he had said with divine inspiration that no one of the living might be called happy.
As a result, the usurped king shouted out Solon's name repeatedly, which made Cyrus, his captor, inquire as to whom he was naming. The story, as if it were a legend, goes that Croesus tells Cyrus Solon's message, and Cyrus, in turn, changes his attitude or intentions. Herodotus says that the Persian
changed his purpose and considered that he himself also was but a man, and that he was delivering another man, who had been not inferior to himself in felicity, alive to the fire.
To make matters more outstanding, it happens that they cannot extinguish the already burning fire. Croesus begins to roast. Yet, the man begs Apollo, the god whose oracle misled him into the war and to whom he had made so many offerings in the past, and no sooner was the prayer said that the weather changed, and fire-extinguishing rain began to fall. Thus Cyrus, by Croesus' willingness, made the now conquered king into his royal advisor, a soon-to-be most useful of royal advisors, like I said, as if it were a legend. In the process, when explaining his own folly for ever going to war, Croesus is quoted as saying,
"In peace the sons bury their fathers, but in war the fathers bury their sons."
A most harrowing aphorism. As for Apollo, the historian clarifies that Croesus reproached to the oracle of Delphi, and that this one explained to him his folly and how in the end the god did save him thus. The god is not only real, but wise and just. If you wish to know how Cyrus and the Persian Empire came about, if you wish to know what is going to happen to Croesus now that he is a captive, if you wish to know how Greece managed to stop the Persian invasion, watch the next videos. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this work.
Frustrated by their frequent mispredictions of the future, scientists overestimate their capacity to predict the past.
The first book, called Clio, Part 2 of 2, Cyrus and the Persian Empire. You will remember that previously Croesus, the king of Lydia, had been defeated by Cyrus, the king of the young Persian Empire. The Persian had chosen not to kill Croesus and instead turned him into a royal advisor. The first counsel that Croesus gives to Cyrus regards how the loot gained by the conquests of his own city should be used. The conquered king counsels the conqueror that if the soldiers are allowed to have at will, inevitably one will grow rich enough to compete against the conqueror. Instead, says Croesus, Cyrus should tax the soldiers under the excuse of a religious offering so as to ensure that no soldier gains too much wealth. This might sound silly, but it is actually very wise.
Where there is not enough taxation, either tyranny arises, or the current tyrant is challenged by a wealthy contender.
Herodotus then describes how the Persians came to be as they were before the war against Croesus, and how Cyrus rose to power. Apparently, among the so-called Medes, a certain man named Diox came to prominence by developing a renown, for wisdom and justice. I must say, this is a bit of a pattern in humanity. It is almost reminiscent of the rise of the likes of Muhammad in Arabia. There would seem to be, at a certain point of development, a tendency for a man to gain control by virtue of charisma, of personality. Either way, this man allegedly convinces the Medes, that is various small towns, to unite and elect him as king. The descendants of this man were warlike, and they conquered the Persians, among many others. They are described as the first rulers of Asia. Of course, that would be the Middle East. Along the way, the historian mentions the first general to organize troops into separate divisions. Also, he attributes the Lydians for inventing many of the games and sports that the Greeks later adopted. Lastly, there is a near legend regarding some Scythian invasion. To be clear, I have gathered, this is not more than a generic term for the wildest barbarians from Central and Northern Asia. Be whatever they may be, these have a lot of success, but then, as they plunder a temple of Aphrodite, the impious are punished by being turned into women. Somehow this carries through generations, as if they had some sort of deficiency in their private areas. The Medes finally regain power and Cyrus's ancestors enter. Here the writer refers to a divine, although macabre, vision as the cause of historical events. In short, let it simply be known that the king dreams that his daughter will give birth to a vine that will cover all of Asia. This is but the last of several visions that worry the king so much that he orders a high-ranking companion to kill his daughter's child. Yet, this man secretly gives the baby boy to a shepherd who in turn keeps him and raises him along with his wife. It's all like something out of a myth. I love it. When Cyrus is older, but is not yet an adult, he is brought before the king because he was rude to a noble boy. Apparently, young Cyrus had been chosen by his classmates as the king in a children's game. The game consisted of the chosen king doing things like giving orders, sending messengers, and I guess ordering punishments. Thus, it happened that he punished the privileged child. The king noticed the similarity in appearance and deduced that this was his grandson. To make a long story short, the king punishes the man he had instructed to kill the child, a man named Harpagos. Most cruelly, truly barbarian-like, the king killed Harpagos' children and secretly fed them to the father. Woe and yuck. As for the young Cyrus, it was interpreted that since he had been elected king in a children's game, the prophecy, the vision, was already fulfilled, as often happens with those visions, you know. LOL. Cyrus, therefore, is sent to his real mother and father. Yet, Harpagos, knowing of his punishment, begins convincing Cyrus to fulfill the real vision. Cyrus organized a rebellion. The king, somehow, gave command of his army to the very servant, Harpagos, whom he had so miserably punished, and Cyrus wins as the servant betrays the king. Since Cyrus was part Persian and part Mede, it is said that this is how the Persians came to rule the kingdom. Herodotus then mentions some trivia about the Persians, such as their culture. He mentions their economic and social stratifications as well as their increased levels of gender inequality. I find uncommendable how he approves of the practice of not letting fathers see their children until these are 5 years old so as to avoid any emotional pain to the father if the child dies. I found this most curious from the practice, which I am sure could not have been universally practiced, to Herodotus' commendation of it. It is, however, commendable how he commends them for having basic protections against the mistreatment of servants and slaves. The historian describes the expansions of the Persians under the command of Cyrus. There are various conquests until those of the Greek cities in the Western Asia Minor. Of these cities, there are references to both Bias and Thales of Miletus. Both propose to the cities what the historian calls most excellent counsels. Bias says that they should all band together and leave for Sicily. There they could have reigned and be free of all threats. Thales says that they should band and form a city for an administrative federal government. I must say, though the latter sounds obvious, most nations in contemporary times have failed to do this. Rather, these are always threatened by inequities of centralism as their capital is always, if not their largest, at least one of the largest, already established population centers. When speaking of Cyrus' invasion of Caria, the historian credits them with inventing or popularizing the use of crests on their helmets. Likewise, with how shields are used. Most critical, the handles of a hoplite shield, as before shields were hung over the shoulder and back. Then enters a description about the greatest conquest of all, the glorious city of Babylon. Herodotus begins by saying that this city, which was then of the Assyrians,
had a magnificence greater than all other cities of which we have knowledge.
He goes into some detail about the various wonders or edifices. The most curious thing is the mention of a tower that was composed of 8 towers, one on top of the other, each one smaller than the prior. In this building a woman was offered to a god for procreation or entertainment. Jocularly enough, Herodotus says that the Egyptians had a similar ritual and that he does not believe that any god actually ever entered to fornicate as was believed. Describing the history of the Assyrians, the rulers of Babylon, the writer emphasizes a queen that, noticing the growing threat of Persia, responded with a massive engineering or terraforming defensive work. She apparently utterly changed the path of some river that flows into the Euphrates and made of it a great defense against the forces of Cyrus. Yet, perhaps even more noteworthy, this same queen, when she died, she set an inscription on her tomb advising any future ruler that within would be found gold and riches that could be used in case of an emergency. When the Persian emperor named Darius, many years later, opened the tomb in unwarranted desire for the gold, he merely found the following inscription:
If thou hadst not been insatiable of wealth and basely covetous, thou wouldest not have opened the resting places of the dead.
Either way, it was the son of this woman that led the military defense against the invading forces of Cyrus. The conflict is described in detail. Obviously, Babylon is eventually conquered, but not without effort and risk. To be brief, let me merely say that the Babylonians could have, if they had anticipated Cyrus' eventual stratagem, flooded a certain area and drowned the whole of the Persian army. In the end, the former Assyria, being so prosperous, encompassed at least a third of the Persian wealth, resources, or capacity. Herodotus gives some, allegedly, details or proofs of the city and of Persian outstanding wealth. I say allegedly as it is hard to put in perspective given the passage of time. Cyrus' invasions did not end with Babylon, of course. Rather, he fights certain Misashtai that were ruled by a woman. I was not able to gather exactly where these were located, somewhere in the Caspian Mountains. It should suffice to let it be known that Cyrus is defeated and killed. Herodotus calls the final battle between these two forces as the fiercest ever fought by two barbarian armies. This ends the first of the books. In the following books, Herodotus describes things such as the insane Persian king that conquered Egypt, the fights between the two Spartan kings, how Athens became a democracy, and, of course, how the allied Greek cities survived the Persian invasion. Make sure you don't miss it. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
As in most cases fortune turns, plucks, and unroots, know that whatever end seems entailed by the beginning is exactly what is least likely to happen.
The second book, called Euterpe, Ancient Egypt. Herodotus begins this book by mentioning that Cambyses took power after Cyrus. This new ruler invaded Egypt. Although the whole book deals with the history of Egypt, it is worth noting the name Cambyses as the book ends with a mention of him. The historian describes the famous, or infamous, bit of scientific testing done by one of the earlier pharaohs of Egypt, Psammetichos. He took
2 newborn children belonging to persons of the common sort,
and brought them up.
that no man should utter any word in their presence,
All 4.
wishing to hear what word the children would let break forth first.
This was supposed to test which race of people first came into existence. Eventually, it was observed of these unfortunate children that they pronounced words similar enough to a word of the Phrygians, and thus it was concluded that those must be the first people that ever came to be. LOL. Regardless, Herodotus credits the Egyptians for being the first to discern the sky and create an effective calendar. He then extensively describes the geography of Egypt and to a lesser extent that of the whole world. This description includes a mention of where, and later in the book how, the stone for the pyramids and many such wonders were gathered and transported. I found this curious given the almost ubiquitous mysticism regarding aliens and the pyramids, given as there is no such stone near their location. Of course, I mean to say ubiquitous among those with more extravagant imaginations. Eventually, after much I will not mention, the historian gets into the much debated question of the Nile. In particular, why does it ebb and grow as it does, and where does it come from? He mentions that there are, or there were in his time, 3 ruling and opposing hypotheses. The first was that the phenomenon of the river rise was due to seasonally changing winds.
The second way shows more ignorance than that which has been mentioned, and it is more marvelous to tell. For it says that the river produces these effects because it flows from the ocean, and that the ocean flows round the whole earth.
I should mention that in a following book the historian references that an Egyptian expedition actually once made it around the whole of Africa. Herodotus continues.
The third of the ways is much the most specious, but nevertheless it is the most mistaken of all. For indeed this way has no more truth in it than the rest, alleging as it does that the Nile flows from melting snow.
The historian provides various reasons why there could not be such snow below the Sahara, from where the Nile must originate. Rather, he provides a hypothesis of his own, a fourth hypothesis.
The sun, being driven away from his former path through the heaven by the stormy winds, comes to the upper parts of Libya.
To make a long story short, somehow, in various ways, he argues that the position of the sun must alter the amount of water in the Nile. For your information, the historian refers to Africa as Libya, and Upper Nile means Southern Nile. The latter segues into a mention of the Ethiopians. Though there are several mentions of them, at first Herodotus tells a story wherein many Egyptian warriors revolted from Psametichos and settled in Ethiopia. Jocularly enough to quote, as the pharaoh pleaded with them not to leave.
One of them pointed to his privy member and said that wherever this was, there they would have both children and wives.
The writer credits these men for pacifying, culturing the Ethiopians. He says nothing is certain of below Ethiopia, but he tells a story of a report about some very small, black-skinned kind of men. As if they were weird creatures from the edges of the map. LOL. The topic returns to discussing Egypt and begins by saying,
It has wonders more in number than any other land.
Yet, he saves such things for later. The reference seems to be but a suspense builder. Rather, he first talks about the Egyptians' manner and habits. Of these there are many, from the women, allegedly, peeing standing up while the men pee sitting down to the practice of male circumcision. I found the latter most curious, and there are several references to it. A later historian, Diodorus Siculus' Library of History, will explain the Egyptian mythology that led to this practice. Herodotus merely explores the spread of the practice, which apparently was inherited by all around Egypt. He says that the only in Libya, Africa, who do not do it because they learned from the Greeks not to do it. Among these he names the Carthaginians. I guess, therefore, the Jewish faith inherited the practice from the ancient Egyptians. There is no mention of the Jews, but other historians, such as Polybius, which you may also learn about on this channel, do mention them. Similarly, the Egyptians' curious eating habits are described. The cow was not eaten, it was considered sacred. I guess as modern-day Hindus. It is the same with goats since the deity Pan was most sacred to them. The latter parallels with a recurring discussion of the gods. These are identified as the same as the Greco-Roman, though with different names and physical representations. Of course, the Egyptian version of Zeus has the head of a ram, for example. Nonetheless, Herodotus says it is Zeus. Funny enough, to the historian's disappointment, they do not have Poseidon or Castor and Pollux. But they do have Heracles, they have him a lot. They in fact consider Heracles one of the main 8. As Herodotus explains, they divide the gods into 8 primaries, 12 secondaries, and all the rest are a third group. By the way, the pig was not so lucky among them. It was considered a most dirty animal. There are many mentions of the Egyptians' religious practices. Among them is a description of a ceremony in honor to none other than Ares, the god of war, in which the participants would strike each other with wooden planks. Let me skip over these things and merely say that the historian repeatedly makes the argument that the Greeks learned about the deities from such barbarians, principally from the Egyptians. Actually, no discourse of the Egyptian culture and their animals is complete without a mention of cats, of felines. Surprisingly, the writer says they frequently kill recently born cats. They do so as the female does not bear living with a male under the same roof after she has given birth to kitties. Nonetheless, when a cat dies, all in the household tend to shave their eyelashes. This must have been funny as he credits them as the only people to shave not only their beard, but also their head, even women. They did have dogs, but they buried these in the house, while cats had special, out of the home, sacred tombs. Let me not skip as much as previously insinuated, as there are many remarkable descriptions, including mentions of the famous crocodile. Let me quote,
Of all the mortal creatures of which we have knowledge, this grows to the greatest bulk from the smallest beginning. Unlike all other beasts, he grows no tongue, Neither does he move his lower jaw, but brings the upper jaw towards the lower, being in this too unlike all other beasts.
Although much more is said, to be brief, know that according to Herodotus, in some areas, the Egyptians love these mysterious beasts, and they even tame them. Oh my Zeus! I would love a crocodile pet. Returning to human practices, the Egyptians are credited as the most developed in the art of medicine. This segues into the practices of mummifying. Apparently, there were 3 economic tiers of such things. Jocular enough, he mentions that beautiful or young women's corpses are not given to embalmers until at least 3 days after they have died. I quote,
The embalmers may not abuse their women, for they say that one of them was taken once doing so to the corpse of a woman lately dead, and his fellow craftsmen gave information.
Truly, deprivation has no borders or time period. Finally, Herodotus gets to the history of Egypt, not yet a description of their wonders. He first describes how the alleged first pharaoh, ever, ordered a terraforming of the Nile. It is hard to understand what exactly the work consisted of, how it changed the course of the Nile, but apparently the Persians still maintain the work by the time of Herodotus. Know that other ancient historians describe these things in greater detail. Several pharaohs later, a certain Sesostris engaged into a so-called exploratory conquest. Apparently, this king not only subdued Arabia, but also much of the Middle East and even the Scythians, which I reckon is meant to describe a general area in the modern steppes of Russia and Ukraine. All along the way, this man left markers which still stand, at Herodotus's times, as proof of how far he made it. This very man, after returning from his military exploration, partitioned ownership of Egypt's land and in the process established their tax system and perhaps invented geometry. Meaning, as the areas of land and taxes had to be measured and assessed, geometry and mathematics were needed. Perhaps not so much to further laud Sesostris, but rather to psychologize, mockingly, Darius, a future Persian emperor. The historian has it that when the latter wished to build a statue besides that of Sesostris, this was objected to and forbidden by the priests of Egypt. They told the Persian that he himself had not yet done anything like the ancient pharaoh. The historian says that Darius might have taken this reproach to heart. Subsequently arrives the rule of Proteus, the same in Euripides' play titled Helen. In fact, it is from this historian that the playwright famously got the plot for that partially lost trilogy. By the way, know that on this channel you may also learn about Euripides' plays. The historian says that he inquired about the veracity of the Trojan legend as he found a temple in the shores of Egypt dedicated to foreign Aphrodite. He was told that they also had heard of the Trojan War, and it was there, on that Egyptian shore, that Menelaus had found Helen. Herodotus supposes that Homer had heard of this possibility. To be clear, it is that Paris unwillingly arrived there after fleeing with Helen. As such, Proteus forbid him from taking the wife of another. Instead, Paris had returned to Troy without Helen, which is why the Trojans could not return her. After all, it is only logical that Priam or Hector would have returned her if they had her. Instead, the whole war must have been fought because the Argives, Menelaus, and Agamemnon refused to believe that she was not in Troy. Either way, this is not exactly as Euripides later dramatizes it. As for Homer's version, the historian points out that the poet has it that Hector and Helen were lost at sea for a while before reaching Troy. Ergo, maybe Homer had heard about this possibility. By the way, you may also learn about Homer's epic on this channel. As to why the gods would contribute or allow such seemingly pointless war, the historian says that it must have been so as to
make it evident to men that for great wrongs great also are the chastisements which come from the gods.
A harrowing thought. After Proteus, there comes Rhampsinitos. This involves a most jocular story. It was a popular story of a rascal that frequently tricked or outwitted the pharaoh. This man was the child of the engineer that built a treasury for the king. A treasury that the king filled with gold and silver. Though the building was otherwise safe, the engineer built a secret loose stone, one that could be moved by his sons to steal the money. Thus, after their father died, the sons started stealing. To make a long story short, the two brothers repeatedly steal from the safe until one of them is caught in a trap and the other is forced to cut off his brother's head. The mother then
threatened that she would and give information to the king that he had the money.
if he, the survivor, did not recover the body of the dead brother that was hung humiliatingly and impiously. The survivor devises a way to recover the body. This involved getting the guards drunk. Afterwards, though Herodotus does not believe this part of the story, the pharaoh puts his own daughter to engage in prostitution for the purpose of having her inquire which of her subsequent many clients might be the thief. She does that very thing. He jocularly reveals himself but manages to flee, eventually.
Rhampsinitos greatly marveled at him, and gave him this daughter of his to wife, counting him to be the most knowing of all men.
Of course, this must be, at least in part, a popular, entertaining legend. There's a brief mention on how the Egyptians believed in reincarnation, and that it is from here certain Hellenes that Herodotus purposely abstains from explicitly mentioning must have gotten the idea. I wonder, who does he not reference? Is it the Pythagoreans? They believed in reincarnation. Either way, I guess such a notion must have been considered impious. The next pharaoh mentioned is a certain Cheops. He is attributed for bringing every kind of evil.
He shut up all the temples, and having first kept them from sacrificing there, he then bade all the Egyptians work for him.
It is he, I reckon, who builds the largest of the famous pyramids. The whole process and engineering marvel is described. This pharaoh is so odiously remembered that it is said of him that he set his own daughter to prostitution and made every client contribute a stone for the pyramid. The next king, Mykerinos, the son of the prior, is remembered well as he revoked his father's evil and returned things to how they previously were. At some subsequent point, Egypt had a blind pharaoh under whose rule the country was conquered by the Ethiopians. These ruled for 50 years until their leader, apparently merely due to an ominous vision, willingly left the country. Then came into power a former priest named Sehos. This one did not get along with the warrior class. Thus, when the Assyrians invaded, the king had to arm the civilians, the shopkeepers and artisans, as the warriors refused to fight. Yet, the night before the battle, in a miracle, a swarm of little mice ate or damaged all of the Assyrians' bows and shields. Thus, the invaders fled and Sehos was victorious by the grace of divinity. The historian says,
And at the present time this king stands in the temple of Hephaestos in stone, holding upon his hand a mouse, and by letters inscribed he says these words,
Let him who looks upon me learn to fear the gods.
Of course, Herodotus loves this. By the way, Hephaestos was one of the principal gods of the Egyptians. I reckon this would be Phat, the god of artisans, engineers, and smith workers. Either way, the historian then makes the following curious remark.
Being set free after the reign of the priest of Hephaestos, the Egyptians, since they could not live any time without a king, set up over them 12 kings, having divided all Egypt into 12 parts.
What I find curious is the mention that they could not live without a king. This fact lies forgotten. To the civilized, monarchies are for barbarians. They need them, for they cannot be autonomous. Either way, these 12 tried to be friends and at peace. Of course, this does not last. There was a prophecy that whoever drank from a bronze cup during a specific yearly gathering or ceremony would be king of all. It happened that one of them, for he was lacking a cup, drank from his helmet, which incidentally was made of bronze. Thus, upon realizing, the other 11 exiled him. Yet this man, feeling unjustly treated, managed to rally certain Ionian and Carian pirates, and beginning with them as mercenaries, he conquered the whole of Egypt. His name was Psammetichos. Herodotus now describes the economy of Egypt. He says the whole society was divided into 7 classes, each for a general profession. All such status was hereditary and fixed. Of the 7 classes, the warriors are held in the highest repute, while the craftsmen are at the lowest. The historian finds it curious how this valuation repeats from society to society. He says that
the Hellenes have all learnt this, and especially the Lacedaemonians. But the Corinthians least of all cast slight upon those who practice handicrafts.
It must be recognized that the prior is an implied criticism or mockery of Sparta. It is as if in this respect they are the most barbarians. Also, Corinth's culture still benefited from Periander's rule. Remember, he was the wise king that defended the lower classes. Likewise, at this time Athens was at least growing to more value craftsmen. That is about it all. Bringing the narrative full circle, the historian repeats that the then ruler of Persia, Cambyses, will invade Egypt and defeat the then pharaoh, a man named Amasis.
It seems that Zeus most often strikes the prideful, but this is because the prideful enjoy boasting about how they were struck, and the envious enjoy hearing about how the prideful were struck.
The third book, called Thaleia, Part 1 of 2, Madness Conquers. Herodotus begins this third book by describing what might have motivated Cambyses to invade Egypt. The more convincing story is that Cambyses asked for a daughter of Amasis, the then pharaoh. The Egyptian, since he knew his daughter would be made into a mere concubine, responded by secretly giving him another woman in pretension. Yet, this woman, in revenge for the fact that the pharaoh had killed her father, revealed her identity to Cambyses. This deceit, according to the Persians, caused the conflict. Let it be known that the historian also reports the Egyptian version of the story, but let me skip over it. Herodotus spends some time discussing the difficulty or wonder that it was to invade Egypt. Cambyses had to secure an alliance with the Arabian tribes, and he had to create the infrastructure to pass the Sinai Desert with a large army. This involved setting up a system still existing by Herodotus' time where jars of water would be frequently distributed through the desert route. Curiously, the historian himself visited the site of the key battle in the Persian conquests and says he found that the Egyptian skulls, from the remaining carcasses, were much stronger than that of the Persians. He hypothesizes a reason, as he says,
The Egyptians beginning from their early childhood shave their heads, and the bone is thickened by exposure to the sun. And this is also the cause of their not becoming bald-headed. For among the Egyptians you see fewer bald-headed men than among any other race.
I know that vitamin D from the sun is key in generating and healing bones. Thus, perhaps he is partially correct. Given the Persian triumph, some of the bordering Ethiopians and other nearby societies of Africa peacefully surrendered to the Persians. There will be more on the long-lived Ethiopians. For now, however, enters the narrative a most heartbreaking story about Samanitos, the son of Amasis. It turns out that Cambyses paraded the daughters of Egyptian nobles as new slaves and over 2,000 noble sons that would soon be executed. Samanitos, who did not shed a tear during this whole procession, later wept when he saw a former friend turned street beggar. Cambyses asks him why he cries for that man and not his own children. The former pharaoh replies,
O son of Cyrus, my own troubles were too great for me to lament them aloud. But the trouble of my companion was such as called for tears, seeing that he has been deprived of great wealth, and has come to beggary upon the threshold of old age.
Croesus, the former king discussed in the first book, cried upon hearing this. The latter in turn took pity from the answer and decided not to kill the former pharaoh and ordered that his son be spared. Yet, the son had already been executed, as he was the first of the 2,000 boys that were killed. To finish the whole heartache, it later happens that Samanitos is found inciting rebellion, and rather than suffer punishment, he drank raw bull's blood, which is apparently a very effective method of suicide. Cambyses gave orders that the former pharaoh's body be burned, be consumed by fire. Herodotus explains that this is most sacrilegious not only to the Egyptians, who believed in mummifying for the very purpose of preserving the body, but also to the Persians who took fire to be a god and thus most impious to feed a human to a god. Egyptians say that they managed to trick Cambyses into unwittingly burning someone else's corpse, but the historian thinks
that the Egyptians make pretense of it from pride, and with no good ground.
Cambyses, still ambitious, planned to invade none other than the Carthaginians. Yet, the Phoenicians refused to collaborate, as that would be like going to war with brothers. Remember, Carthage was founded and settled by them. Cambyses did not dare force them as.
The whole naval force was dependent upon the Phoenicians.
As a result, the king shifted goals to the Ethiopians. He sent messengers, spies, to them, and the Ethiopians' king replied to these messengers is more worthy of quote.
Neither did the king of the Persians send you bearing gifts, because he thought it a matter of great moment to become my guest friend. Nor do ye speak true things, for ye have come as spies of my kingdom. Give this counsel to the king of the Persians, that when the Persians draw their bows, of equal size to mine, as easily as I do this, then he should march against the long-lived Ethiopians, provided that he be superior in numbers.
The movies they could make, the scenes that lie in waiting. Truly, as with Plutarch, each book could be turned into at least one, if not several, movies. Remember, you can also learn about Plutarch's writings on this channel. In further discourse, the Persian messengers learned that the Ethiopians live up to 120 years of age, allegedly. That they ate mostly boiled meat. I say that is the healthiest way of eating meat, especially if it is boiled using an electromagnetic oven, and drank mostly milk, as the philosopher Friedrich Nietzsche insisted all men should. Apparently, they had a most special fountain, one whose water was so light that common wood, or just about anything, would sink in it. Herodotus says of this,
If this water which they have be really such as it is said to be, it would doubtless be the cause of why the people are long-lived, as making use of it for all the purposes of life.
Also, gold among them was so common that their money was measured on the rarer bronze. It reminds me of the Mesoamericans who valued jade. Cambyses, already showing signs of madness, invades without proper preparations, meaning without proper supply. Thus, he meets a Crassus-like fate. More as Mark Antony given that he personally survives, but much of his army is destroyed by mere hunger and thirst. When he gets back to Egypt, things only get worse. First, since the Egyptians were amid a celebration, it turned out that a special cow, yes cow, had appeared and that this was either an actual or sign of a deity. The emperor did not know this and thought they were celebrating his defeat. When they explained it to him, Cambyses did not believe the tale and thus ordered scores of people executed. Then, upon gaining attendance before the cow, he tried to kill it and ended up stabbing it in the leg, the thigh. Yes, the madman tried to kill the beloved cow. Of course, all this was an outrage to the Egyptians. Yet, that was but the mere beginning of the harms of hereditary tyranny. First, he had his brother killed. A brother whom
he had sent away from Egypt in envy, because alone of all the Persians he had been able to draw the bow which the messengers brought from the Ethiopian king to an extent of about 2 finger breadths.
I found the detail curious, LOL. He did likewise with one of his sisters. Then he started marrying his other sisters, the inbreeding that plagued the species. He did other horrible things. For example, after he killed a child whose father had attempted to advise him against madness, he told the very father,
Praxasps, it has now been made evident, as thou sayest, that I am not mad, but that it is the Persians who are out of their senses.
I quote it as a typical insane person thing to say. Similarly, good old Croesus also met the axe. The former advisor of Cyrus attempted to help correct him, and the madman responded with such fury that he ordered him executed. Yet, Croesus is saved by some guards thinking that the mad king will change his mind, or forget, and ask to have him again. Eventually Cambyses does that very thing and finding that Croesus is still alive is glad, but nonetheless executes the guards that disobeyed him. Again, typical mad ruler things, LOL. Luckily, the madness eventually affronts the gods. He mocks the images of the Egyptian Hephaestos and has some of the images burnt. This leads the historian into a brief digression in which he asserts that all men would choose their own customs over that of others, thus the subjective nature of such valuations. To substantiate or prove this claim, the writer makes reference to Darius. The latter, it is told, asked some Hellenes if they would take money in exchange for eating the corpses of their parents. The Greeks were, of course, outraged at the proposition. Yet, Darius then asked some Indians if they would burn the corpses of their parents in exchange for some money, and these were outraged by this opposite proposition. To be clear, it is told that the Indians would eat their deceased parents. There is more of this later, and, of course, the Greeks would burn their dead. Herodotus then quotes Pindar.
Of all things, custom is king.
Of the latter, I should note, it is often translated as law, rather than custom or tradition, but I think that my translation is the truer. I mean, the historian just explained it. So, if you ever hear anyone say law is king, please correct them. At this point, Herodotus switches focus back to the Greeks. He tells about the first time that any Greeks fought in Asia. It had happened that a certain tyrant named Polycrates had taken command of the island of Samos. This man had made an alliance with Amasis, the former Egyptian pharaoh. This Greek tyrant's life was faring so pleasantly that the pharaoh gave him the following counsel.
Take thought and consider, and that which thou findest to be the most valued by thee, and for the loss of which thou wilt most be vexed in thy soul, that take and cast away in such a manner that it shall never again come to the sight of men.
The reasoning being that none may live a life of absolute good fortune, thus best to be the bringer of misfortune oneself than wait a possibly worse turn from fate. Now that is some ancient wisdom. I personally fear it might actually be correct, LOL. Polycrates agreed with the advice and decided to throw away a ring, a very valuable signet. He threw it far into the sea, yet, as if it were a fable, again, all this could be made into a movie. A Samian fisherman caught a very large and tasty-looking fish. This fish was so much so that, though the fisherman was poor, he offered it as a gift to Polycrates. The latter was gladdened by the gift and invited the fisherman to dine with him. Then, as would be expected from a fable, the royal cooks found the signet within the fish. The fish had eaten it before being caught. Polycrates was overjoyed, as any would be, at the amazing turn of fate. Yet, Amasis, upon hearing about these events, concluded
that it was impossible for man to rescue man from the event which was to come to pass, and that Polycrates was destined not to have a good end. Therefore he sent an envoy to him in Samos, and said that he broke off the guest friendship, and this he did lest when a fearful and great mishap befell Polycrates, he might himself be grieved in his soul as for a man who was his guest.
This was all to describe the man whom the Lacedaemonians, the Spartans, were embarked against. They were doing so in part to revenge the theft of a priceless bull that was once sent to Croesus. This is told in the first book, but I had skipped mentioning it as I knew we would return to it. The Spartans were not the only ones arrayed against Polycrates. There also was Periander, the wise Corinthian king. In Herodotus' explanation of why the Corinthians had a grudge against Samos, he enters into a digression of why the Corinthians had a similar grudge against Corcyra, a city they themselves had once founded. Meaning, the narrative contains a digression within a digression. LOL. By the way, in case you have forgotten, Periander is one of the 7 wise men of antiquity. One could say that he was a philosopher king before philosophy. Yet, alas, the ensuing story does not do him any favors. Apparently, Periander had dispatched some 300 boys to be made into eunuchs. These boys were from leading families of Corcyra. Unfortunately, the historian does not tell the backdrop of this. I know that Corcyra was settled by Corinth, and as such it could be called a colony, but it was not common that the father city would control the colony in any way. It was, however, uncommon for such cities to do each other harm. I should mention, according to Thucydides, it is a conflict between Corinth and Corcyra that starts the Great War between Athens and Sparta, what is often called the Peloponnesian War, but I agree with Xenophon, it should be called the Pan-Hellenic War. Of course, you may also learn about all these historians on this channel. Be it as it may be, in a humanitarian spirit, the people of Samos rescue these boys from castration. So, that is a reason for Periander's involvement against Samos, but not a complete explanation of his issue with Corcyra. It turns out that the king of Corinth killed his own wife and mother of his 2 children. Far from the thing one would expect from a philosopher king. Long story made short, the father of the deceased woman, another king, tells the boys about how their mother died. One of the two was, apparently, rather stupid and did not care. The other, however, ceased to speak with his father, and Periander ended up exiling him. Apparently, Periander ruled it illegal for anyone to help his exiled son. Therefore, the boy
laid about in the porticoes enduring exposure. And on the fourth day after this, Periander, seeing him fallen into squalid misery and starvation, felt pity for him.
Yet, the boy would not return to the murder of his mother. Eventually, Periander, growing old and finding that his other son could not be given rule, accorded with the exiled to change places. He, the king, would go to Corcyra, where the boy was, and the boy would, in synchronization, go to rule in Corinth. It must be said, surely Periander was wise, as it appears from other writings, but no human is perfect. Either way, the Corcyraeans, not wishing to have Periander present, killed his son and broke all ties with Periander. Obviously, the historian withholds part of the story. Back to the invasion of Samos, the mainly Spartan force fails to capture the city, but the historian attributes this as the first time any Greek, especially any Dorian Greek, fought in Asia. The term Dorian refers to something akin to the modern notion of race. Some Greeks, racist Greeks, believed that there was Dorian Greeks and Ionians Greeks, LOL. So much for the simultaneous events occurring in Greece. Returning to Egypt and the Persians, two of Cambyses' half-brothers, not pure Persians, but rather part Mede or Magians, attempted to usurp the throne. They did so in a clandestine fashion, however. One of them pretended to be the recently killed full brother of Cambyses, the one that Cambyses had executed over the jealousy regarding the Ethiopian vow. Remember, as it will be key, these rebels were secretly not Persians. Cambyses first inquired as to whether his brother had indeed been killed as he had ordered. After becoming convinced that the rebellion was being perpetrated by impostors, he attempted to ride from Egypt back to Persia. However, the vengeance of the insulted god struck. As he mounted his horse, Cambyses accidentally mortally wounded his leg. It was the same leg, on the same spot, where he had struck the cow the Egyptians were formerly revering. He did not die right away, rather his wound became infected, and he had time to write to the Persian leaders that they should avenge his death. In the second half of this book, the Persians not only recover their empire, but Herodotus also reminds us of what is real democracy, and what are the arguments made against it and in favor of it. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
The more the successful becomes aware of his own flaws, the more he is convinced that his greater talent is luck.
The third book, called Thaleia, Part 2 of 2, The Political Philosophy. The prior part of this book ended with the untimely death of Cambyses. You will recall that he was the mad Persian king that had had such trouble with the divine Egyptian cow. Since before dying the king had managed to write to Persia warning the other members of the Persian elite about the impostor that had assumed the throne, an individual named Otanes began investigating. Herodotus says that Otanes deduced that the impostor must be a person that lacks ears. It turns out that Cambyses had previously cut off his half-brother's ears, and Otanes suspects this brother is the impostor. Yet, the Magian would keep himself highly guarded and out of sight. There was no way to confirm the suspicion. So Otanes comes up with a plan. This involved asking his own daughter to sleep with the new emperor and in the process check if the man had any ears. The young woman manages to achieve the plan. Despite the danger, she discovers that indeed, the new emperor lacked ears. Hearing this, Otanes gathers a group of men and attempts a rebellion. At first, the group was made of 6, but at the end they became 7 as Darius was invited to join. Famously, immortally, during their dangerous assembly, it is reported that Darius said the following:
Either let us do the deed today, or be ye assured that if this present day shall pass by, none other shall prevent me as your accuser, but I will myself tell these things to the Magian.
The reasoning being that the longer they waited, the more people they attempted to include, the higher the chances someone would betray them. As such, Darius convinced them to be bold. Although they were merely 7, they storm the palace, uncover the pretender, and regain the command. It could be a movie. The writer describes the whole covert mission and action, all the killing and fighting. At one point he says that,
If night had not come on and stopped them, they would not have left a single Magian alive.
nonetheless, the part for me to relate is their subsequent orations, that is, after they had regained command and had to decide how rule would be divided. Herodotus, knowing the unbelievable nature of what he relates, begins by saying,
There were spoken speeches which some of the Hellenes do not believe were really uttered.
As you will see, few would believe such things were uttered by barbarians, but perhaps all is possible. First, Otanes says,
Ye saw the insolent temper of Cambyses, to what lengths it went, and ye have had experience also of the insolence of the Magian. And how should the rule of one alone be a well-ordered thing? Even the best of all men, if he were placed in this disposition, would be caused by it to change from his wonted disposition.
So he is against monarchy, against the rule of a single person. Even more commendable, as for what the government should be, he says.
On the other hand, the rule of many has first a name attaching to it which is the fairest of all names, that is to say, equality. Next, the multitude does none of those things which the monarch does. Offices of state are exercised by lottery, and the magistrates are compelled to render account of their action. And finally, all matters of deliberation are referred to the public assembly.
Yes, Otanes argues in favor of democracy, of true democracy. Notice how he mentions the lottery, random selection, and public assemblies. Alas, the myriad of contemporary servants that think they live in a democracy. Yet, unfortunately, the other Persians disagree with Otanes. A certain Megabyzos says that,
Nothing is more senseless or insolent than a worthless crowd. The people cannot even know, for how can that know which has neither been taught anything noble by others nor perceived anything of itself?
So, he shows the elitism from which true democracy is most often criticized. Not to mention the paradox, as, of course, how could the people know, if they are never given a chance to learn? This man then proposes the now termed representative democracy, but was then titled oligarchy.
Let them choose a company of the best men, and to them attach the chief power, for in the number of these we shall ourselves also be, and it is likely that the resolutions taken by the best men would be the best.
I find commendable that Herodotus let the reader see the true motivation behind this proposition. Notice how the speaker entices representative government by the idea that those like himself and his associates, the powerful, will naturally be the ones more likely to be chosen. Last to be cited in this debate is Darius. He disagrees with all the prior and argues that
Nothing better can be found than the rule of an individual man of the best kind, seeing that using the best judgment he would be guardian of the multitude without reproach, and resolutions directed against enemies would so best be kept secret.
the question of secrecy is a common issue with democracies. Pericles famously addresses it in his surviving funeral oration. Besides the mentioned, Darius also criticizes true democracies for being prone to corruption and representative democracies, oligarchies, for fomenting parties, groups, that battle each other. I would like to point out that corruption is actually less common to democracy than any other form of government. I mean true democracy. As for the second issue, party conflict is common to all and may only be dealt with by adequate laws and a commendable system of upbringing. All governments require a correct system of upbringing. As Socrates would say, Spartan education with Athenian distribution of power. Alas, humans seem to be incapable of willing such a thing. Back to the events, the 7 men vote and Darius' argument wins. Otanes responds by asking to be excused from the opportunity of ruling in exchange that he and his descendant be made priests of Zeus and are absolved from taxation. The others agree, and thus only 6 remained. The remaining 6 agree that they will choose who will be king by random selection. Jocular how among each other they are a democracy. Darius basically cheats the selection process and thus is made king. The historian describes the various reforms of the new monarch. Nothing radical, rather merely a new structure to the portions of Persia and how much tax each had to contribute to the central treasury. Along the way, there is a digression about the Indians who eat their dead or even their sick. It is said that this happens even if the sick attempts to deny or hide his sickness. Most horrid. So as to not leave such shade upon the Indians, of which these cannibals were merely a portion, the historian also says,
Other Indians have, on the contrary, a manner of life as follows. They neither kill any living thing, nor do they sow any crops, nor is it their custom to possess houses, but they feed on herbs.
This is more fit of the pacifists Indians the likes of Gandhi would commend. LOL. Oh yeah, since I am laughing, Herodotus also says that the Indians have communal sex like the cattle, and that, like the Ethiopians, their sperm is black or dark, rather than the common white. LOL. If there is any doubt, let it be known that the historian surely merely heard a falsehood. More is said about the Indians, including how they fight or flee from what could be called giant killer ants. I will skip over these things, remember these would be people at the edge of the map, and instead mention how Herodotus hits upon a premise to the theory of evolution. He says,
It seems that the divine providence, as indeed was to be expected, seeing that it is wise, has made all those animals prolific which are of cowardly spirit and good for food, in order that they may not be all eaten up and their race fail, whereas it has made those which are bold and noxious to have small progeny.
This is said as part of a digression on the serpents found in Arabia. Yet, I must say, if compared with the way common people understand the theory of evolution as an alleged force that maintains an alleged balance of nature, then Herodotus figured it out. By the way, Lucretius reports in his epic poem on natural philosophy that Epicurus figured out something quite similar to Darwin's theory of evolution. Of course, you may learn about Lucretius and Epicurus writings on this channel. The conversation then shifts to Arabia, specifically the various spices and perfumes that are produced there. Also, some special sheep whose tail is so long that the farmers build little carts that the sheep pulls while the cart carries their tail that would otherwise get damaged for dragging on the ground. I wonder what animal he is speaking of. Either way, he continues describing what he has surely only heard about until he says,
It would seem that the extremities which bound the rest of the world on every side and enclose it in the midst possess the things which by us are thought to be the most beautiful and the most rare.
It is a funny thought, and perhaps an implied criticism of much of what he has previously mentioned. LOL. Returning to historical events, Darius kills one of the other 6 that had partaken in the prior military operation. Noteworthy is the fact that as Darius was planning to execute the whole family of the aforementioned man, the wife of this man requested that her brother, not the husband or her sons, be spared. When Darius asked her about her reasoning, she explained,
King, I might, if heaven willed, have another husband and other children, if I should lose these, but another brother I could by no means have, seeing that my father and my mother are no longer alive.
Truly, such were different times and different people. Or, she had a poignant awareness of the temporal dimensions of life. Perhaps this woman was most intelligent, perhaps merely most cruel, perhaps she disliked her own children, who knows. After this story, Herodotus returns to the Greeks. In envy at his wealth and success, a Persian governor assassinated Polycrates. You will remember, he was the king who threw the ring into the ocean all to see it return inside a fish. Lamenting the inglorious nature of Polycrates' death, the writer says,
Not one besides of the Hellenic despots is worthy to be compared with Polycrates in magnificence.
Yet, do not wallow so to speak, as the Persian governor was subsequently assassinated by Darius. Yes, the new emperor is cleaning house. It is curious how the assassin was chosen by lottery. Many wanted the honor of being the assassin. The task had to be performed covertly, by deceit. A frontal assault would have meant war. Either way, to make a long story short, after video game-like action, the assassin triumphs. Finally, all secure and with his power holding firm, Darius severely sprains an ankle. The Persian doctors fail to heal him, and he ends up requesting attention from a famous Greek doctor. His name was Democracies, and he hailed from the small city of Croton.
By using Hellenic drugs and applying mild remedies after the former violent means, he caused him to get sleep, and in a short time made him perfectly well, though he had never hoped to be sound of foot again.
Democracies was so much compensated for his services that, as Herodotus puts it,
even his servant grew rich.
Interestingly, the historian mentions that it was at this time that Croton, the city, got its reputation for great physicians. Yet, not all was good for Democracies, as the emperor did not let him return to Greece. Instead, he ended up, essentially, as a slave. Aiming for freedom, wishing to return to Greece, the doctor made a deal with Darius' wife. He successfully healed a tumor on her breast in exchange for having her manipulate Darius into invading Greece. Yes, that, according to the writer, is what nearly destroyed the young Western civilization. LOL. Key to the plan is that the wife convinced Darius to include the doctor into the party of spies and diplomats that would precede the invasion. Of course, Democracies merely wished a chance to escape back to his native land. He did, and he found the people of Croton willing to defend him and protect him as the party of Persians that had been sent with him attempted to recover him. This whole thing infuriated Darius and further cemented his intentions to invade Greece. The king first invaded the island of Samos. He did so with the intention of returning control of the island to the brother of Polycrates. Once again, fit for a tale, Darius had met the brother of the former king in the most serendipitous manner. When Darius was a mere spearman in Cambyses' army, Silason, the brother of Polycrates, met him at a market in Egypt. Darius was interested in a mantle, but could not then afford it. Silason, seemingly inspired by good fortune, gifted it to the then stranger in an entirely altruistic fashion. Now that Darius was king of the Persian Empire, this Silason had sought him and asked him to return him his rightful rule of the island. Truly, it pays to be generous. LOL. Herodotus relates how tragically, after the assassination of Polycrates, the man that took power in Samos wished to make the city into a democracy. Yet, the people did not wish to recompense this liberator with the priesthood of Zeus, and some individuals planned to become dictators regardless. Thus, the island entered into civil conflict and
all this happened because, as it appears, they did not choose to be free.
To make a long story short, it happened that the Persian commander, the same Otanes of the seven that regained power for Persia, saw himself forced to decimate the city. The invasion of Greece did not continue right away because Babylon rebelled. In quite a feat of cruel fortitude, the Babylonians, who had not only been provisioning for the expected siege since the issues with Cambyses, also killed most of the women, as these would be fruitless mouths to feed. As such, Darius saw himself embroiled into a seemingly everlasting siege to recapture the famed city. The historian relates that one of the Babylonians shouted from the walls of the city,
"Why, O Persians, do ye remain sitting here, and not depart? For then only shall yet capture us, when mules shall bring forth young."
Of course, it subsequently happened that a captain's mule gave birth to a baby mule. I wonder, does this happen on rare occasions? Either way, this captain, whose name was Zopyros, decided that this occurrence was a sign. Yes, somehow this convinced him to try a most dangerous and difficult plan of action.
He cut off his nose and his ears, and shaved his hair round in an unseemly way, and scourged himself, and so went into the presence of Darius.
He did these things to himself so that he could pretend defecting, switching sides. He explained to Darius that with these wounds the Babylonians would not only accept him, but perhaps give him some command. Subsequently, he could gain certain arranged, intentional, victories against Darius. If he won enough, and they planned the whole thing out, he would be given much responsibility and he would open the gates of the city. Of course, the plan worked. After almost 2 years of siege, the city was retaken, and Darius repopulated it by adding about 50,000 young women from elsewhere to substitute for the ones that had been killed prior to the rebellion. of Zopyros' wit and sacrifice.
Darius is said to have declared often that he would rather that Zopyros were free from the injury than that he should have 20 Babylons added to his possession in addition to that one which he had.
Curiously, the son of this man commanded against the Athenians when the latter fought in Egypt, and the grandson of this man deserted, honestly, to the Athenians. Here ends the third book. In the next book, Darius invades the northern barbarians, which leads the historian to describe all sorts of wonders about the then undeveloped Europe. If you do not know how things got to this point, or if you wish to know what happens to Darius, make sure to watch the other videos. Now, to ignite your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
As courage is pleasant and fear is painful, it is often more pleasant to suffer with courage than not to suffer with fear.
The fourth book, called Melpomene, the Northern Barbarians. After retaking Babylon and repopulating it, Darius, the Persian emperor, began preparing to invade the Scythians. Of the latter, Herodotus describes how after they returned from their own prior invasion of the now Persian Empire, which was then controlled by the Medes, they had to contend against an army comprised of their former slaves. Apparently, as the women they had left behind for about 28 years had all married or remarried to their own former servants and slaves. Thus, upon returning, they had to fight against these men and their new children. The historian then delves extensively into what amounts to mythology. I will not only skip this, but also most of his geographic descriptions, as these too are rather mythological in nature. As such, I must admit, I will be skipping much of the book. It should suffice to mention that Herodotus explains that there are many proto-nations in the vast territories north of Greece and Illyria. To be clear, this is all the then unknown Russian steppes and northeastern Europe. He gives a description of each tribe or group and mentions their exceptionally harsh winters. Let me quote him as he says,
I think therefore that by the feathers the Scythians, and those who dwell near them means symbolically the snow. This then which has been said goes to the furthest extent of the accounts given.
Meaning, at those latitudes, allegedly, the snowflakes are as large as bird feathers. LOL. The historian's geographic descriptions do not end there, however. He casts criticism of the classification of the world into 3 continents, as it was then classified. Curiously, he mentions that nobody knows the size of Europe, and therefore it may be very much larger than Africa and Asia. Conversely, the limited size of Africa was known to him. I found the latter amazing. First, he describes how a certain Egyptian pharaoh, named Nikos, set Phoenicians from the Gulf of Arabia with the mission to return from the Pillars of Hercules. Unbelievably.
In the 3rd year, they turned through the Pillars of Heracles and arrived again in Egypt.
Meaning, they must have sailed all around Africa. Of course, this could be but a mere tale. Similarly occurs to a much later generation. This time it was the Carthaginians under the direction of the Persian king Xerxes. A man is sent on the reverse mission. That is, to go from the Pillars to the Gulf of Arabia. Herodotus says that this man reported
that at the furthest point which he reached he was sailing by dwarfish people, who used clothing made from the palm tree, and who, whenever they came to land with their ship, left their towns and fled away to the mountains. And they, he said, did no injury when they entered into the towns, but took food from them only.
Unfortunately for this explorer, he was sent on this mission as an alternative punishment for having violated a noble young woman. Therefore, since he failed to sail the whole way round and instead returned from where he came, Xerxes completed his punishment and executed him. I guess negative reinforcement is not all it is said to be. The likes of Columbus and other explorers were successful merely by greed and vainglory. LOL. Either way, equally curious, the writer believes that Asia is about the same size as Africa. He seems to think that, or considers it to, end at the Indus River. Europe, on the other hand, for all he knows, is boundless. Of course, it is not. He is rather closer to the boundaries of Europe than those of Africa and Asia. The ignorance was unavoidable, Western Europe at that time was as undeveloped as southern Africa. Returning to the Scythians, Herodotus derides them as the most ignorant and barbaric nation known to the civilized. Yet, he does say they are the best at one particularly beneficial art.
That most important thing which they have discovered is such that none can escape again who has come to attack them, and if they do not desire to be found, it is not possible to catch them.
It is funny as the Russians have proved time and time again not to have lost this ability yet. Equally curious, while describing some more of the Scythians' cultural practices, the historian mentions that they scalped the head of their defeated opponents. Yes, similar to certain Native American tribes. Allegedly, the Scythians had the practice of not only drinking the blood of their defeated foes, but also of removing the skin from their face or head by cutting from ear to ear. Let me quote him as he says,
He keeps it as a napkin to wipe the hands upon, and hangs it from the bridle of the horse on which he himself rides, and takes pride in it. For whosoever has the greatest number of skins to wipe the hands upon, he is judged to be the bravest man.
Then there is mention of how much they disliked foreign beliefs. This notion introduces the story of Halicarnassus, a Hellenized king that met his death due to worshipping in a Hellenic fashion. The latter is adjoined to the claim that
the Scythians make the rites of Bacchus a reproach against the Hellenes, for they say that it is not fitting to invent a god like this, who impels men to frenzy.
I found this noteworthy as this would be a similarity between barbarians and the great majority of the modern, allegedly Western, believers. The Dionysus is a cult for a truly civilized people. Now he finally gets to Darius' invasion. Herodotus first describes the marvel of engineering that was the bridge across the Hellespont. Surely it must have been a sight to see. The first people that Darius conquers were Thracians known as the Getae. These are remarkable for their belief in the eternal continuity of the soul or spirit of the living. Believe it or not, every 4 years they would honor a man at random as a messenger to the afterlife world. The Getae, of course, would kill this man. Never mind any details about it. If the prior does not seem remarkable, then consider how they arrived at this belief. Here features a Greek man named Zalmoxis. He was, in some way or other, instructed by Pythagoras. The historian praises the philosopher, which is of itself noteworthy. Either way, Zalmoxis told the Getae about the afterlife, and while he did so,
he was making for himself meanwhile a chamber under the ground. And when his chamber was finished, he disappeared from among the Thracians and went down into the underground chamber, where he continued to live for 3 years. And they grieved for his loss and mourned for him as dead. Then in the 4th year he appeared to the Thracians, and in this way the things which Zalmoxis said became credible to them.
Jocularly, although he commends Pythagoras, the historian does express some doubt about the tale. Regardless, it is a very valuable tale as little to no Pythagorean writing remains. Not that it was ever easy to get any. Remember that Pythagoras maintained that knowledge should be protected from those that would use it immorally. Therefore, knowledge should not be written down. The critical thing is that this is yet another case where it would appear that Pythagoras counseled in favor of religion as something that would benefit humanity. I must say, I have grown to wholeheartedly agree. Perhaps religion may do bad, but no religion would be worse. The thing to keep in mind, as long ago I crafted.
Religion must be to the wise man as morphine is to the good surgeon and doctor.
Herodotus then describes the cultural practice of the nations, tribes, bordering the Scythians. Among these is what I consider a confirmation of Euripides' Iphigenia at Aulis, though that play takes place somewhere in Thrace. It is a great play, from a great playwright. Remember, you may learn about him on this channel. The reference is relevant as the historian speaks of barbarians sacrificing lost travelers. Then there are tribes that have shared sexual relations, such that no man knows which are his children. Truly, the nuclear family is contrary to the natural order of things. All the benefits that could be had if none knew which were her own child. The writer also mentions a tribe that are descendants of Amazonian women, which is why their women hunt and engage in other, typically manly practices. Of course, modern man knows that in primitive societies women partook in hunting as much as the men. On top of that, this tribe has the rule
that no maiden is married until she has slain a man of their enemies. and some of them even grow old and die before they are married, because they are not able to fulfill the requirement of the law.
Herodotus is truly jocular. About Darius' invasion, the Scythians attempted to unite all these tribes to oppose the Persian force, but they failed. As a result, they engaged in a scorched earth tactic. Remember, like modern Russia. In the process, they moved into, and thus took the pursuing Persians into those various countries that had refused to unite. They did this so as to compel them to take up arms. Another comical mention is how the nomadic barbarians had difficulty disrupting the Persian supply and foraging parties because the nomads' horses were afraid of the Persians' mules and asses.
Often, as they were in the middle of riding against the Persians, when the horses heard the voice of the asses, they turned back in confusion and were possessed with wonder, pricking up their ears because they had never heard such a voice nor seen the form of the creature before.
The northern barbarians did not have these animals, as these could not survive the harsh winter. Either way, after much attrition, the Scythians send a force to the bridge across the Hellespont. The bridge was guarded by some Ionian Greeks, and the Scythians attempted to convince them to destroy the structure and thus abandon Darius and the Persian army. Realizing the peril, Darius decided to abandon all the wounded soldiers in his army and hurried back to the bridge. Herodotus relates that Miltiades, the Athenian, I do not know how or why he was there, argued that they should do as the Scythians counseled. Yet, a certain Milesian despot argued that it would only mean future punishment given that the Persian Empire would not be destroyed by the mere death of Darius. This Milesian tyrant, as most of the Ionians present, personally needed the Persians to secure their power in their cities. In the end, they merely feinted to destroy the bridge to fool the party of Scythians, and Darius arrived before the main Scythian force. The historian says of the barbarians, seemingly deriding the Ionian despots,
their judgment of the Ionians is that on the one hand, if they be regarded as free men, they are the most worthless and cowardly of all men. But on the other hand, if regarded as slaves, they are the most attached to their master and the least disposed to run away of all slaves.
I ask, what kind of slave would you have been? Then there is a mention of present-day Libya. Darius had sent a force to invade certain cities there. Noteworthy is that these cities had the practice of letting the king sleep with any newly married woman. The historian describes much about them, but let me only mention the fact that they would burn the sides of their heads, for the belief that it had some medical purpose. Furthermore, it is said that these Libyans
are in truth the most healthy of all races concerning those of which we have knowledge.
These invasions are successful, so it is not all failure for Darius. Herodotus only returns to the happenings in Europe to the Greeks in the next book. In the next book, Athens will grow into a democracy. This will foreshadow the dispute with Sparta, but first the democracy will try to free the Greek cities that were then controlled by the Persian Empire. Now, to ignite your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
Since whether one is lost is never clear, therefore you must always explore whether you are. Unfortunately, since to be lost is painful, the majority never search if they are.
The fifth book, called Terpsichore, Democracies United. After his failed expedition in Scythia, Darius left Europe and his commander Megabazos started subduing the still free people of the Aegean Sea, the area between Europe and Asia Minor. Curiously, the historian describes how instead of a battle against the Corinthians, the two sides agreed to 3 Iliad-style combats, meaning 3 individual fights in the area between the two armies. What I found curious is that 2 of the combats were meant to be carried out by animals, a pair of horses and dogs, one of each from each side. I find this as another proof, akin to the fact that up to not so long ago animals used to be tried in court, that, well, primitive man was more aware that there is not that much difference between man and other animals. Eventually, Megabazos marched into Thrace. This may be confusing as the historian previously stated that Darius had already conquered the Thracians. Yet, it might be, I deduce, that by Thracians Herodotus now means all the native Western Europeans. Consider how he says that besides the Indians, these people are the most numerous in the world, such that
if it should come to be ruled over by one man, or to agree together in one, it would be irresistible in fight and the strongest by far of all nations.
A European tribe that practiced polygamy is mentioned. In this tribe, allegedly, whenever a husband died, the surviving wives competed for the honor of being sacrificed to accompany the deceased in the afterlife. This may seem utterly incredible, however, another ancient historian, Diodorus Siculus, describes the same behavior among a certain Indian tribe that Alexander the Great encounters. Diodorus' account on this point is very remarkable. Of course, you may also learn about his writings on this channel. Then enters a story fit for a popular movie wherein a Macedonian prince takes rightful revenge on some abusive Persian diplomats. The latter asked for Macedonian women to service them sexually. The Macedonian king felt obliged to abide. Yet, the son of the king, named Alexander, did not stand by the abuse and disguised some men as women and had them kill the Persian ambassadors. The prior leads to the claim that the Macedonians are not barbarians but Greeks. The historian says that he will prove it in the next book, but does mention the simple fact that they were accorded the right to participate in the Olympics. Skipping some details, Otanes is given command of the Ionian cities. He conquered the Byzantines and Caledonia. The historian then describes how the Ionians on the western coast of Asia Minor deposed their respective tyrants. I must admit that I will be skipping much, perhaps because I find it rather inconsequential and perhaps because this portion of the account is rather difficult to follow. It should suffice to know about a certain self-interested scoundrel that first aims to profit by the Persians and then instigates the rebellion against them. This man goes to Sparta to requisition aid against the ensuing Persian retribution. The prior allows the historian to describe how Cleomenes attained the throne of Sparta. Don't confuse him with the Cleomenes described in Plutarch's biographies. That one comes later. Either way, the historian describes this Cleomenes negatively, as his father had accidentally ended up with two sons, each from a different woman. What is negative is that his counterpart, the other child, seemed to have been more competent or intelligent. Yet, the dumb one gains the crown because he was slightly the elder. As to why his father had ended up with children by different women, it turns out that his wife could not bear children, and the Ephors, fearful that the line of Heracles would be lost, asked him to get a technical second wife. Yet, by the time this new woman gave birth, so did the first that previously had not. It is a curious story. Returning to the scoundrel and the newly freed Ionians, the scoundrel is rejected by the Spartans, and thus he goes to Athens. This segues into how Athens came to be the democracy that it was at that point in time. You will remember from the first book that Pisistratus has taken control of Athens. So, a certain noble family that disliked the sons of the tyrant bribed the oracle of Delphi into telling the Spartans that they must free Athens. Therefore, Cleomenes is sent to Athens at the head of an army. The Athenian people took the opportunity to rebel, and together with the Spartan force, they overthrew the tyrant and his family. They did not kill the king, rather they traded his captured sons in exchange for him peacefully leaving. Of course, getting rid of the tyrants is one thing, but establishing a democracy is a whole extra venture. Herodotus explains that there were two ruling orators or politicians, Isagoras and Cleisthenes. Isagoras was popular among the wealthy, while Cleisthenes introduced a platform very popular with the common people. He suggested dividing everyone into 10, as opposed to 4, tribes. These, I have always opined, are akin to voting districts, though they are not geographic or economic. They were determined by random selection, and therefore they were impartial and egalitarian. Such is the value of random selection, the only true impartiality and fairness. In response, Isagoras called on Cleomenes to help him. The Spartan king demanded that the Athenians expel Cleisthenes and marched with a small, personal force into Athens. Cleisthenes was forced to flee the city, and Cleomenes installed the rule of 300 unelected despots. Yet, before he left, the Athenians rose up in revolt and besieged him and these oligarchs. In the end, the Spartans were allowed to leave under a truce, Cleisthenes returned, and democracy was further established. The Athenians sent messengers to Persia seeking alliance for what seemed a certain war against Sparta. In the meanwhile, Cleomenes prepared a large force of all the Peloponnesians with the intent of placing Isagoras as tyrant in Athens. Yet, when this army reached the front lines, the Corinthians refused to fight on behalf of tyrannizing other Greeks. Soon enough, Democracies, the other Spartan king, also refused to partake in the endeavor and thus split the army in two. As a result, Cleomenes had to abandon his plans. So as to avoid such divisions in the future, a law was passed in Sparta that whenever an army marched outside the city, it could only take one king with it. On these incidents, we may see the beginnings of the political divide that will bring about the Great Pan-Hellenic War. Know that Thucydides and Xenophon, who are also described and analyzed on this channel, discuss it in detail. The Athenians, meanwhile, were not satisfied with merely fending off the Spartans. Enlivened by their new freedom, they sought revenge from some who had aimed to help Cleomenes. In particular, they invaded the Chalcidians and the Boeotians. Herodotus praises democracy as he describes how and why the Athenians rose so staggeringly fast in power and mastery over their neighbors.
Equality is an excellent thing, since the Athenians, while they were ruled by despots, were not better in war than any of those who dwelt about them, whereas after they had got rid of despots, they became far the first. This proves that when they were kept down, they were willfully slack, because they were working for a master, whereas when they had been set free, each one was eager to achieve something for himself.
The historian describes a war against the Thebans. The Spartans once again grow interested as they see Athens growing to match them in power. Once again, Cleomenes attempts to unite the Peloponnesians against Athens, but once again the Corinthians disagreed. A certain Sophocles is quoted as saying,
Surely now the heaven shall be below the earth, and the earth raised up on high above the heaven, and men shall have their dwelling in the sea, and fishes shall have that habitation which men had before. Seeing that ye, Lacedaemonians, are doing away with free government and are preparing to bring back despotism again into our cities.
Herodotus takes the opportunity to clarify and explain the history of despotism the Corinthians had suffered. The latter involves yet another tale fit for a movie. To make a long story short, Corinth was a hereditary oligarchy, meaning the rulers were not even elected, instead they openly inherited. Either way, a prophecy is made that the next child will become a horrible ruler, and so plans are made to kill the child. Yet, the assassins fail, due to the pity they feel for the baby. So, the boy grows but turns out to rule in an acceptable way. Yet, as Machiavelli warns, the son that follows him grows to be tyrannical. Of course, on this channel you may also learn about Machiavelli's writings. Famously, the youth learns how to be a tyrant from another tyrant. Herein is a now famous analogy.
The best way to keep order and rule is to cut down all the wheat stalks that are too tall.
It is similar to Mao Zedong's analogy concerning nails that must be hammered down. Needless to mention, this tyrant does horrible things, such as set fire to a bunch of women, both noble and common. The historian does not describe how Corinth gained its freedom or what kind of government it then had. He does quote the same previous speaker as saying,
Such a thing, ye must know, Lacedaemonians, is despotism, and such are its deeds. Know that the Corinthians at least do not give their consent to that which ye do.
I imagine, of course, that at that moment Corinth must have been what we would now call a representative democracy, one as Sparta, though without egalitarian economics. Perhaps they even had a bit of real democracy. In the end, the Peloponnesians refused to comply with the Spartan suggestion and war with Athens is avoided, that is, until after the Persian invasion, of course. Herodotus now returns to the doings of the scoundrel. He speaks before the Athenian people at the Hill of the Nix and convinces them that they should aid the Ionians gain freedom from the Persians. He did so by telling them that the Persians were poorly trained and did not use good weapons. That part must have been partially true. The Persians not only had a barbarian military structure with unelected generals, but most of the soldiers would have been unwilling draftees without training and with poor weapons, if any armor at all. I mention the prior as the historian says,
For it would seem that it is easier to deceive many than one, seeing that, though he did not prove able to deceive Cleomenes the Lacedaemonian by himself, yet he did this to 30,000 Athenians.
This has become, throughout history, a classic criticism of democracy. I would like to say,
persuading others is not, and has never been, a matter of facts. Persuading others is a matter of rhetoric, otherwise known as manipulation.
Or how about,
the efficacy of a speech depends less on the veracity and logic of the message than on the education and emotion of the audience.
Either way, Herodotus says, speaking of the Athenians' decision,
These ships proved to be the beginning of evils for the Hellenes and the barbarians.
of course, the Athenians sent merely 20 ships to the western coast of Asia Minor. The scoundrel deceived them only in the sense that he did not truly intend to free the Ionians, but rather to make himself a tyrant. The military expedition involved the accidental burning of a temple of a certain Persian goddess named Hybib. The Persians took this as justification for later burning every Greek temple that fell in their hands. Woe to humanity. Speaking of Darius, let me quote.
He charged one of his attendants that when dinner was set before the king he should say always 3 times, Master, remember the Athenians.
There were many battles, some in which the Greeks performed outstandingly, often utterly extinguishing the Persian forces. Yet, obviously, through persistence and fresh troops, the Persians defeated the rebellions. In the end, the scoundrel is forced to flee to Thrace, where he is killed by barbarians. Although the 5th book ends here, the 6th book describes further details about these failed rebellions. Aside from the rebellions, Herodotus' next book mocks the Spartans and celebrates the eternal renowned Athenian triumph at the Battle of Marathon. Now, to ignite your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
It is not that crowds are easier to deceive than individuals. Rather, since most individuals are foolish, then all crowds are gullible.
The 6th book, called Erato, Broken Sparta and Athenian Success. The beginning of this book completes the story of the Ionian rebellions. A key figure is a despot of Miletus named Histiaeus. He deceives Darius into setting him free as if he had never intended any rebellion. Subsequently, he betrays the Persian king a second time by gathering over 350 triremes against him. Even though the barbarians had about 600 ships, the Persian commanders were frightened. They decided to promise pardon to any rebel that would surrender without a fight. In the meantime, the rebelling Greeks initially did not give Histiaeus supreme command. Rather, they elected a man named Dionysios. Alas, if the story Herodotus tells is true, the subsequent events are eternal proof of humanity's weakness and imbecility. Dionysios is quoted as telling the volunteer soldiers,
If ye shall be willing to take upon yourselves hardships, ye will have labor for the time being, but ye will be able to overcome the enemy and be free.
The men agreed, but only for about 7 days. Unaccustomed to the hardships and training that Dionysios instituted, they changed their opinion, their will, and replaced him with Histiaeus. At the battle, the Greeks who had not trained properly were defeated. Herodotus condemns many from Samos for fleeing under the agreement that they would receive pardon. Shameful, truly. I must point out that the failure cannot be attributed to democracy in the army. That practice was ever common among the Greeks and Romans. The problem in this case is best attributed to the inherent or natural softness in humanity. Therefore, the story does lend weight to, for example, Hobbes' view of mankind. Without proper upbringing, training, the best the not-so-hairy monkeys can do is to pray for a good tyrant. Otherwise, all they will have is but the tyranny of stupidity and weakness. As for Histiaeus, he is captured in some later battle, and since the Persian commanders feared that he might deceive the king a second time, they killed him although he already was a prisoner of war. As for the rest of the reconquest of Ionia, Herodotus describes the method the Persians would employ to clear the smaller islands.
They extend themselves from the sea on the north to the sea on the south, each man having hold of the hand of the next, and then they pass through the whole island hunting the people out of it.
The practice seems jocular. There are several other conflicts whose details are not only difficult to follow, but ultimately inconsequential. I can say for entertainment sake that at one point a fleet of Persia is lost in a sea storm and the historians suggest the possibility of sea monsters. LOL. All these operations involve conflicts around the Hellespont, Thracia, and a little-remembered attempt at attacking Athens. After regaining the lost cities and taking most of the islands, Darius sends heralds to all the cities of Greece asking for earth and water, symbols of subjugation. This leads to Cleomenes, the king of Sparta, attacking the Aeginetans for accepting the barbarian demands. This in turn leads to a conflict between the two Spartan kings, which segues into a digression on why one of the kings of Sparta was technically more honored than the other. I will only explain the more jocular elements. First, in a mythic past, the then queen mother of twins did not wish to reveal which of the twins was the elder. Being the elder meant, of course, being the first heir. Lycurgus, the mythic founder of the Spartan civics, spied the queen to check which twin she ever fed, bathed, dressed first. Somehow this would show which twin was the elder. Equally silly, let me quote.
The custom of the Lacedaemonians about the deaths of their kings is the same as that of the barbarians. They beat their foreheads with a good will and make lamentation without stint, saying that this one who has died last of their kings was the best of all.
Surely, presently, some overprivileged first-world self-flagellator would accuse the historian of being culturally insensitive towards the subjects of any monarch. LOL. More relevant history is that Demaratos, the other Spartan king, accused Cleomenes of being illegitimate. He made such an accusation because of mere envy. Such causes are common in Herodotus' Histories. You will remember that the prior king had had 2 wives. It turns out that Cleomenes came from a wife that was not pregnant for the minimum amount of time required. Regardless, Cleomenes survives the accusation and in turn accuses Demaratos of being the child of a stable boy. Yes, such are the issues in monarchy. To succeed, the king bribes the prophetess of the oracle. This was later found out and some of the culprits, including the prophetess herself, were banished. Regardless, in the meantime, Demaratos is deposed and ends up in Asia under the protection of Darius. Herodotus continues praising Demaratos and therefore condemning the Spartans when he credits him as the only king to ever win an Olympic gold medal. Most jocular, Demaratos asked his mother for the truth, and she told him that she did sleep with an apparition 3 days after first sleeping with the king. They could make a television show about this story. I am sure it would sell. Also, the man that replaced Demaratos, a certain Leotychides, was later banished from Sparta as he took bribes from certain barbarians. It should be noted that the kings did not go through Spartan education. Skipping ahead, Cleomenes leaves Sparta for a time as the scandal of bribing the oracle makes him unpopular. While living in a foreign land, he contemplates invading Sparta, and even though some in the Senate try to help him,
Forthwith a disease of madness seized him, who had been even before this somewhat insane, began to maltreat himself from the legs upwards. For he went on cutting his flesh lengthways from the legs to the thighs, and from the thighs to the loins and flanks, until at last he came to the belly. And cutting this into strips he died in that manner.
I found all the prior most funny and important. It is an underemphasized case of Spartan corruption and institutional failure. I wonder what the likes of Machiavelli would say of it. Since he thought Sparta's government was the best that could ever be, I guess he would say it is as good as it gets among the not-so-hairy monkeys. Herodotus digresses into the possible reasons for Cleomenes' madness. He mentions 3 theories. According to the men of Argos, it was divine punishment for his military cruelty. According to the Spartans, it was because while he lived with the Scythians, he drank unmixed wine. According to the historian, it was retribution for the impious treachery against Demaratos. Returning to the incoming Persian invasion, I quote,
There happened more evils to Hellas than during the 20 other generations which came before Darius, some of the evils coming to it from the Persians, and others from the leaders themselves of Hellas warring together for supremacy.
This is most tragic given as Herodotus is speaking before the Pan-Hellenic War. He does not even know about the horrors that will come after. And to think that all of this at the same time that philosophy and Western culture are beginning to bloom. The historian describes how, upon learning of Darius' attack, the Athenians send the whole of their own men, under the command of their 10 elected generals, to confront the Persians near the town of Marathon. One of the 10 generals, or strategos, was the now most famous Miltiades. Pay attention because what follows is one of the eternal highlights of human history. First, the runner Phidippaides is sent to ask aid from the Spartans, who reply that they may not go until a certain religious duty is passed. On his way, Phidippaides reports he encountered Pan, the divinity. This is the divinity of panic, most valuable to all martial ventures. The god told the messenger that he will help if the Athenians promise to honor him. As a result, after the battle, a temple was made in its honor at the Acropolis. I believe the temple, or sanctuary, was made in a cave on one of the sides of the Acropolis, but I am not sure. Funny enough, a son of the previously ousted tyrant was serving as a guide to the Persian army. This man, allegedly, had suffered a disappointing vision or dream. Ergo, while disembarking he tripped, fell, and lost a tooth in the sand. When he stood up, he said that his vision had come true, for the little of Attica that truly belonged to him was now possessed by the tooth. LOL. As for the battle, Herodotus has it that the Athenians defeat the Persians, and only then do the Persians try to circumvent the Athenian position. Other historians say that the Athenians only attacked the Persians after they had already divided their forces, aiming to perform the previously mentioned operation. Either way, Miltiades is credited for convincing the other elected generals to charge rather than hold a defense height. Let me emphasize that, be it as it may have been, they attacked despite being greatly outnumbered.
For they were the first of all the Hellenes about whom we know who went to attack the enemy at a run, and they were the first also who endured to face the Median garments and the men who wore them, whereas up to this time the very name of the Medes was to the Hellenes a terror to hear.
Of course, this was a blessed day for humanity, as in the later Battle of Salamis, had things been otherwise. Perhaps progress would have ever been arrested by hereditary tyranny. The battle cost the Athenians exactly 192 men. By comparison, incredibly, the barbarians lost over 6,000. I must make clear, though I will not provide the specifics, a large factor in such casualty ratios is the meritocracy inherent in the military democracy of civilized nations. No such thing has existed in most of the alleged Western world since the fall of the Roman Republic. After the battle, the Athenians had to deal with the force that was sent to circumvent their position. Therefore, they quickly moved to where they expected the Persians would make a second landing. Being still in their boats, and not willing to attempt a contested landing, the barbarians were forced to abandon the whole campaign. It was then, after all the fighting had finished, that a Spartan force showed up. These were most disappointed with themselves to see the Athenians had succeeded without their help. Note, in a single military operation the Athenians protected the city, defeated the Persians, defeated what remained of Pisistratus, and even humiliated the Spartans. As such, these events entered the Athenian national myth or historical narrative. Herodotus celebrates it, and just about everyone in the Western world ever praises it. After all these events, there is a mention of the family that was most key or essential in deposing the previously mentioned tyrant. What is worthy of record is how the mention segues into the genealogy of Cleisthenes and Pericles. The two were related and both were essential to the progress of humanity. The one a founder of democracy, the other not only furthered it to unparalleled levels, but oversaw the Athenian Golden Age. The latter is not to hero worship. As the philosopher Cratopus of Pergamum might say, they were merely those most influential at the time democracy came about. After the Persians were defeated, Miltiades convinced the Athenians to give him command of an army with the intention of attacking a certain Greek city that had allegedly aided the Persians. The description of the events segues into a description of a feud the Athenians had with the Lemians. On the latter, the historian is basically disputing the facts with another historian. Unfortunately, very little of this other historian survives. Whatever may be the true cause of the feud, whether Athenian envy or Lemian unwarranted violence, it is clear that the latter kill a host of Athenian women and children. Yes, The Lemnians had stolen the women, used them as concubines, but the children that resulted grew to consider themselves Athenians. As such, fearful that the children, when they reached adulthood, would take over Lemnos, the same men that had impregnated the women killed them and the children. Most horrid. As such, the expression Lemnian deed came to signify a deed of great cruelty. In the end, and to finish the summary of the 6th book, Miltiades captured the city of Lemnos. In the next book, Xerxes, the son of Darius, begins a gigantic invasion of Greece. This includes a description of the famous battle at Thermopylae. If you don't know how we got to this point, be sure to watch the prior videos. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
If you feel your happiness never lasts, that is not because your future is always bad. Rather, it is because you are ever jealous of the past.
The 7th book, called Polymnia, the first line at Thermopylae. Herodotus tells that after the Persian defeat at Marathon, Darius was more determined than ever to invade Greece. He began massive preparations, yet, after 4 years of preparing, Egypt revolted. Before ensuing, the writer explains the debate over whom will inherit Darius' legacy. There were 2 contenders, a certain Artabazanes and Xerxes. Both were his children, however. The first had been born before Darius was king, while Xerxes was born after Darius assumed the throne. Since Democracies, the former Spartan king, was already living in Persia, he counseled that it should be Xerxes that be made king, as that was the practice in Sparta when such issues came up. As such, since Darius died before he could invade either Egypt or Greece, such tasks were left to Xerxes. The historian has it that the new king was more than willing to reconquer Egypt, but he did not wish to challenge Hellas. Unfortunately, Mardonios, a general, convinced him. I rather enjoyed what Xerxes says to his generals, his family members.
I will not cease until I have conquered Athens and burnt it with fire, seeing that they did wrong unprovoked to me and to my father. There is no city of men nor any race of human beings remaining, which will be able to come to a contest with us, when those whom I just now mentioned have been removed out of the way.
Allow me to say, had the Persians conquered Greece, all manner of discoveries and progresses might have not yet taken place. Consider how, it was only about 300 years ago that Westerners explained to Easterners Anaximander's theory of relativity, that the Earth is round. Know that on this channel you may also learn about much of the surviving pre-Socratic writings. Mardonios, the hawkish, glory-seeking general then mocks the Greeks' manner of fighting. In particular, the practice of agreeing upon a common ground to fight their battles. You know, noble and civil manner of fighting, LOL. But there is a counterweight to Mardonius, a certain Artabanos. He is more dovish and, if not peaceful, certainly cautious. He counsels Xerxes against invading Greece. Let me quote.
But thou, O king, art intending to march against men who are much better than the Scythians, men who are reported to be excellent both by sea and on land, since the Athenians by themselves destroyed that great army which came with Datis and Artaphernes to the Attic land.
He warns that whatever bridge is laid across the Hellespont might be captured, as it almost happened when Darius invaded the Scythians. I should note, these speeches were filled with possible aphorisms, what I call aphoristic boulders. For example, one was about the nature of counsels of advices. Another amounts to a religious proof, a pagan proof of the need to be humble. On the final video of the series you may hear what I turned them into. Another example, consider how Artabanos chastises Mardonios. He accuses him of lying about the Greeks, as he says,
For slander is a most grievous thing. The slanderer does a wrong in that he speaks against one who is not present, the other in that he is persuaded of the thing before he gets certain knowledge of it.
Despite the wisdom of his words, Xerxes is initially only enraged and further insists on his decision to invade. The most curious events ensue. Surely what follows cannot be entirely true. First, despite suffering dreams that told him he should proceed with the invasion, Xerxes calls back his orders. Yet, the dreams keep haunting him. The dreams tell him that he will lose his throne if he does not attack Greece. The emperor is caught in an awful bind. He cannot yet again change his orders, as that would make him appear undecisive, but he is afraid of his dreams. Xerxes, therefore, asks Artabanos to sleep in his bed, as whatever alleged force that is causing the dreams might then affect Artabanos as well. Curiously enough, Herodotus has Artabanos argue that dreams are not caused by any deity or divine power. Rather, he says that they are caused by whatever preoccupies the mind. Nonetheless, Artabanos humors Xerxes, sleeps in his bed, and lo and behold, he too suffers a most vivid dream. The dream also told him about the importance, the need, to invade Greece. Therefore, with that excuse, Xerxes is able to, once again, change his orders without appearing too fickle and undecisive. I should mention that Xerxes is rather young at this time. Not a minor, but still more akin to a young man. Also, to be perfectly clear, he had already reconquered Egypt and set it under an even harsher rule than before. As for the army he assembled to invade Greece, the historian says,
First of all the armies of which we have knowledge, this proved to be by far the greatest.
Almost poetically, the writer enumerates all the famous armies that were smaller than this one. Xerxes then sent messengers to all of Greece asking for earth and water. All of Greece, except Athens and Sparta. It turns out that both, Athens by the hands of Themistocles and Sparta by the hands of Leonidas, killed the previous Persian messengers. Such a deed gives me goosebumps. Funny enough to mention, while laying out the bridge across the Hellespont, a storm appeared that destroyed the work, and thus Xerxes literally had the waters flogged. Yes, he put people to flog the ocean, as they said.
Thou bitter water, thy master lays upon thee this penalty, because thou didst wrong him not having suffered any wrong from him.
Also, as a typical tyrant, he had the engineers' heads cut off. Herodotus describes much about the army and the crossing, but perhaps most noteworthy is some philosophical musing he places in the mouths of Xerxes and Artabanos. First, the king weeps as he sees the majesty of his army, and when asked he says he does so as he is confronted with the brevity and ultimate insignificance of life. His commander replies,
No man, either of these here or of others, is made by nature so happy, that there will not come to him many times, and not once only, the desire to be dead rather than to live. For misfortunes falling upon us and diseases disturbing our happiness make the time of life, though short indeed, seem long, and God, having given him to taste of the sweetness of life, is discovered in this matter to be full of jealousy.
Come to think of it, one or several aphorisms may be crafted out of this, likewise with,
Know that accidents will rule men and not men the accidents.
Many such gems ensue. However, I cannot quote those here and now, as this is intended to be a short summary. Although, consider that there even is a possible logical premise, possible as all such premises are merely possible, that would disprove much, if not all, of the Big Bang Theory. Returning to the narrative, Herodotus describes various bad omens the Persians suffered as they crossed the Hellespont. These included a mare giving birth to a hare and a mule being born with both genders. The historian numbers the army at about 170,000. Of course, other historians' numbers differ. Regardless, it was the largest force to ever invade Europe until the Allied invasion of Normandy during the currently called World War II. Xerxes counted the total number of his men by having 10,000 men grouped together as tight as they could and marking the boundary of the group. Then he had group after group fill the marked boundary, and, eventually, they found the aforementioned number as a most estimable total. In describing the generals and admirals serving Xerxes, Herodotus makes special mention of Artemisia. She is the now most famous Greek warrior queen of Halicarnassus. Let me quote,
Being a woman. For after her husband died, she holding the power herself, although she had a son who was a young man, went on the expedition impelled by high spirit and manly courage, no necessity being laid upon her.
Xerxes would later grow to consider her his best advisor. Asking for such counsels, Democracies told the king that,
with Hellas poverty is ever an inbred growth, while valor is one that has been brought in, being acquired by intelligence and the force of law, and of it Hellas makes use ever to avert from herself not only poverty but also servitude to a master.
When Xerxes expresses his doubt that men would fight against such numbers unless they were forced to do so by a king, Democracies pointed out that to the Greeks, or Lacedaemonians in particular, the law itself was a greater king than any mortal man could ever be. All the places that Xerxes passes during his march south to Athens are described. Most cities were forced to pledge allegiance. They would tend and supply the barbarians. Apparently, the Persians would even drink the rivers dry. On the latter, Xerxes mocks the Thessalians for having an allegedly easy land to conquer, as he could have diverted a river to flood all their cities. In discussing the Athenian and Spartan preparations for facing the enemy, Herodotus makes the strong point that if the Athenians either fled Greece altogether or simply submitted, then all
Hellas would have come to be under the rule of the Persians.
This segues into a description of several messages or prophecies from the oracles. The latter in turn segues into a description of Themistocles. Remember, this is one of Plutarch's great and noble. First, the historian explains how Themistocles, who had already acquired a great deal of renown and influence as a speaker and wise man, convinced most that the oracle words signified that ships, not walls, would defeat the Persians. At this point, it is important to know that the Athenians had already agreed that no private person could own the silver mines located in their territory. The wealth of the mines was managed by the democracy, and it was divided between all of the citizens. As remarkable as the prior is, more remarkable is how, following a conflict against the Aeginetans, Themistocles convinced the Athenians to cease dividing the wealth for their own private gains and instead finance the construction of a great navy. I quote the historian's words.
For this war having arisen proved in fact the salvation of Hellas, by compelling the Athenians to become a naval power, and the ships, not having been used for the purpose for which they had been made, thus proved of service at need to Hellas.
Truly, thus is fortune. In this case, allow me to say, division and competition between the decentralized Greece engendered mastery, ensured autonomy and independence. Herodotus then describes why certain key Greek cities did not aid or join in the conflict. First, he mentions Argos and in part excuses them as they had recently suffered horrid losses in a war against Sparta. He does mention that they asked for some concessions from the Spartans, but only in vain, knowing that the Spartans would not concede. The latter segued into an observation I have never forgotten. It is very personally enlivening. The historian says,
I know this much, that if all the nations of men should bring together into one place the evils which they have suffered themselves, desiring to make exchange with their neighbors, each people of them, when they had examined closely the evils suffered by their fellows, would gladly carry away back with them those which they had brought.
Of course, I cannot avoid thinking of this a truth not only of large populations, nationalities, but also of individual people. I certainly can imagine proof of it, and as I said, it is joyous wisdom. There is a reference to the Syracusans. The story he tells here involves a series of tyrants ending with a certain Gelon. This man, basically out of greed, would only agree to help in exchange for extended power. First, he asked to be made commander of all the Greek land forces when the Spartans refused. Then he asked to be likewise of only the naval forces, but when the Athenians refused, and also a conflict with the Carthaginians arose, he ended up merely sending some provisions. It is said that this man defeated the invading Carthaginians on the same day that the Athenians defeated the Persians at Salamis. Either way, Syracuse has a funny history. Too many tyrants and seemingly never secure democracy, though always a very important city. You may learn more about Syracuse and Gelon from Diodorus Siculus' Library of History. It is an amazing, action-packed story. Lastly, among these defectors were the Cretans and the Corcyraeans. The latter, Herodotus argues, feinted support, but their ships never arrived, alleging unfavorable winds. The former had as an excuse a message from Delphi, Either way, the few Greeks that did join together agreed to send a force to meet the Persians in a land battle at Thessaly. Yet, they had to abandon the position as they could have been surrounded. Thus, the Thessalians submitted, and the remaining allies agreed upon a stand at the now famous Thermopylae. On the events that led to abandoning Thessaly, there is a curious remark about how some Persians captured a Greek ship and executed a prisoner simply because of his beauty. Apparently, they wanted the pride involved in killing the most beautiful man of the enemy. I find such a thing very curious. Luckily, by divine will, a storm arose that wrecked a large portion of the Persian fleet. This storm raged for over 3 days. It makes Herodotus refer to Poseidon as the savior. Describing the Greek force that gathered at the narrow passage of Thermopylae, the writer confirms that due to a religious inconvenience, the Spartans were only able to send 300 men. In fact, no city sent more than 1,000 soldiers. Of course, Herodotus describes many things such as the Persian scout that saw the Greeks exercising and combing their long hair. On this, Democracies told Xerxes that it meant they were preparing to meet their death. Since the barbarian king could not believe that so few would attempt to stand against so many, he paused for 4 days simply waiting to let the enemy run away. Unfortunately for Xerxes, once they did attack, the Greeks
made it evident to every man, and to the king himself not least of all, that human beings are many, but men are few.
I will turn it into a less haughty aphorism. All the Greeks took turns fighting on the first line. Then there is a mention of the now infamous Ephialtes. In all likelihood, it was him that showed the Persians how to get around and envelop the Greek position. 1,000 Greek Phocians had been set to guard the mountain pass. Herodotus credits them as having been willing to fight to the death. However, the enveloping force was not interested in them and thus bypassed them. In the end, the historian credits Leonidas for ordering most Greeks to leave while he stayed behind with his Spartans, as well as some Thespians and Thebans. I must say, the latter two are unfairly forgotten about. All these men fought in the most courageous manner and brought all manner of death to the barbarians before their final fall. Let me quote,
"There was no reckoning of the number that perished. For knowing the death which was about to come upon them by reason of those who were going round the mountain, they displayed upon the barbarians all the strength which they had, to its greatest extent, disregarding danger and acting as if possessed by a spirit of recklessness."
Herodotus says that 2 of Xerxes' brothers were killed during this last day of fighting. Although he does not explain how this could have happened, Diodorus Siculus has it that the remaining Greeks performed a surprise attack on the Persian camp. I feel a movie should have shown that. Herodotus credits Dionysius, the man that uttered some now eternally famous sentences such as, "Then we will fight in the shade," 2 brothers, Alpheus and Maron, and a Thespian, Dithyrambos, as the most courageous of those that died that day. Of course, they were all as courageous and essential for the worthiest thing in the world. Xerxes was, of course, distraught at the adversity, challenge of this ultimately meager victory. He asked Democracies for advice, and the former Spartan king told him he should invade an island south of Sparta. This would threaten the Spartans' home and make it impossible for them to aid the other cities. As such, Xerxes might then conquer without the Greeks being united. Of this plan, Xerxes' brother and admiral refused since so much of their navy had been destroyed by the previous storm. There was little confidence in dividing their fleet further. Frustrated and angry, Xerxes had the head of the already dead Leonidas removed and his body crucified. This practice towards corpses was most unusual for the Persians and proof of Xerxes' frustration. To end this book, Herodotus attempts analyzing, perhaps excusing, Democracies' behavior. I will skip such details. Simply let it be known that it is plausible that the exiled Spartan was in fact playing the role of a double agent, informing the Greeks while pretending to help the Persians. In the next book, the Athenians will have to abandon their city, the barbarians will threaten the Oracle of Delphi, and many will call for breaking up the Greek Union. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
Although a leader may provide insurmountable motivation, equality of opportunity, unlike the leader, may be everlasting.
The eighth book, called Urania, The Sailors That Could Not Swim. Know that the events of this book take place after the famous Battle of Thermopylae. The historian begins by outlining the Greek naval forces. He commends the Athenians for sharing their ships with the citizens of other cities. Perhaps this is a clear sign that the Greeks were nearly as if a nation, as opposed to merely separate city-states. The historian also makes a special commendation to the Athenians in the fact that they ceded ultimate naval command to the Spartans. He commends them in the sense of being mature about the matter and thus preserving Greek unity. On this issue, let me quote him as he says,
"For disagreement between those of the same race is worse than war undertaken with one consent by as much as war is worse than peace."
I suspect or believe that an aphorism regarding disagreement between democracies may be crafted out of the analogy. I should now mention, regarding these praises, that though the writer might not have been born in Athens, he is a bit of an Athenian. So much so that in this book he will show a bias concerning an Athenian political controversy. I am referring to his seeming affronts towards Themistocles. Yes, Themistocles grew to become quite controversial. Unfortunately, proper details about him are best learned from Plutarch's biographies. Herein the writer simply starts by accusing the man of receiving bribes or payments from other Greek cities. Wishing to avoid capture, these cities wanted the allies to make an early stand against the Persians. This resulted in an unconclusive naval battle that was allegedly fought at the same time as the final battle at Thermopylae. It was maneuvering as a result of this battle that the Persians were so afflicted by the sea storm mentioned in the prior book. Remember, the storm that Poseidon the Savior granted to Western civilization. LOL. After these battles and storm, Athens and many cities outside the Peloponnesus had to be abandoned. The Athenians gathered their navy and many of their people on the nearby island of Salamis. I found noteworthy how, before leaving, Themistocles himself had a message carved for the Ionian Greeks serving under Persian command. It read,
Ionians, ye act not rightly in making expedition against the fathers of your race and endeavoring to enslave Hellas. Best of all were it that ye should come and be on our side. Be purposely slack. Remember that ye are descended from us, and that our quarrel with the barbarian took its rise at the first from you.
The intention was to either have the Ionians betray, or to have Xerxes mistrust them. Likewise, most noteworthy, the historian mentions how the Persian monarch attempted to trick his own sailors about the Pyrrhic victory that was the Battle of Thermopylae. I use that term though King Pyrrhus is a couple of centuries later. You may learn about him from Polybius' Histories. Xerxes, the Persian king, hid most of his dead, but Herodotus says the deceit must have been apparent. I imagine that it could not have been kept secret as soldiers talk among each other. Worthy of mention is the event wherein some deserters, men in need, came to the Persians and informed them on various subjects. Among these subjects was the Olympic Games. Of them, a certain commander named Tigranes replied,
"O Madonios, what kind of men are these against whom thou hast brought us to fight, who make their contest not for money but for honor?"
Remember from the prior books that Mardonius is the hawkish general that most insisted on invading Greece. In a digression, the historian then describes a conflict between certain Thessalians and Phocians. The story involves a Phocian soothsayer general named Teleas the Elean. This man enacted some action movie-style military strategies. First, on one occasion, he had all the Phocians cover themselves with white chalk and then make an attack during the darkness of the night. As might be imagined, this tactic allowed the Phocians to keep order in the darkness and frighten the Thessalians. Likewise, this same soothsayer had a very long trench dug and filled with empty jars. The trench was then covered with slight earth and leaves so that the Thessalian horses ended up breaking all their legs. Again most clever, and seems as if out of a movie. These Thessalians, now serving under Xerxes, asked the Phocians for money in exchange of ensuring good graces and treatment from the Persians. The Phocians refused, and Herodotus jocularly says of the matter,
If the Thessalians had supported the cause of the Hellenes, I am of opinion that the Phocians would have been on the side of the Medes.
Now enters the fate of the Oracle of Delphi. The oracle advises all people to flee as he, the god, could take care of himself. To make a long story short, as a Persian force arrived before the oracle, thunder fell onto the barbarians, divine shouts were heard, and most barbarians fled in fear. Make of that what you will. In Athens, the priests at the Acropolis had trouble convincing people that they should abandon the city. Comically, it was believed that a great serpent lived below the Acropolis, and thus believers had the habit of leaving it food, such as large honey cakes. Of course, something would eat the cake. Yet, on the last days, the food was left untouched, thus most believers did believe that they had to leave the city. LOL. I should point out that Herodotus writes as if he knew what was really going on, but he does not denounce the priests or religion. Either way, some people did stay in the Acropolis. Xerxes did have a tough time breaching their defenses and killing them, but he eventually did do so, as well as set fire to the whole city. As for the Battle of Salamis, the historian counts the number of Greek ships as 378. I should note that such a number is far superior to any naval battle of modernity. Thus, it was with naval battles in antiquity. As I was saying, initially the Greek commanders concluded that they had to flee the island of Salamis. The Peloponnesians were already fortifying the Corinthian isthmus, and they wanted to make their stand there. A companion of Themistocles tells him that,
If they set sail with the ships from Salamis, thou wilt not fight any more sea battles at all for the fatherland. For they will all take their way to their several cities, and neither Eurybides nor any other man will be able to detain them or to prevent the fleet from being dispersed, and Hellas will perish by reason of evil counsels.
The Greek commander then conveys this same reasoning to Eurybiades, the Spartan commander-in-chief. Eurybiades agrees and gives Themistocles the chance to convince the other Greek leaders. The Athenian is then quoted as saying,
Hear both ways and then set them in comparison. If thou engage in battle at the isthmus, thou wilt fight in an open sea, into which it is by no means convenient for us that we go to fight, seeing that we have ships which are heavier and fewer in number than those of the enemy. Engaging in a narrow place with few ships against many, if the fighting has that issue which it is reasonable to expect, we shall have very much the better, for to fight a sea fight in a narrow space is for our advantage.
A Corinthian answers with seeming personal odium, saying that the Greeks should not listen to a man without a city. In response, Themistocles threatens that the Athenians will leave the whole of Greece and settle in Italy or elsewhere. Eurybiades interjects and orders that they must remain on the island. Herodotus has it that they did consider Themistocles' threat was sincere. As for the Persian plans, there is a special mention of Artemisia, the queen of Halicarnassus. She, of all advisors, counsels Xerxes not to fight a sea battle at all. Let me quote her.
Spare thy ships, and do not make a sea fight, for the men are as much stronger than thy men by sea, as men are stronger than women, for the Hellenes are not able to hold out against thee for any long time. But thou wilt soon disperse them, and they will take flight to their several cities, since neither have they provisions with them in this island, as I am informed, nor is it probable that if thou shalt march thy land army against the Peloponnese, they who have come from thence will remain still, for these will have no care to fight a battle in defense of Athens.
Herodotus describes how many in Xerxes' court hoped that Artemisia's disagreement may lose her favor. Yet, Xerxes welcomes her opinion but does not abide by it. He hopes that his subjects will fight most courageously now that he himself will be present watching over them. To be clear, he expects fear of punishment will motivate them to fight harder. LOL. In all seriousness, it is arguable that there is great motivation, effort, and resilience in thinking that a greater being, at least one capable of bestowing recompense or punishment, is overlooking one's manner of being and behavior. This is an element that is not entailed in democracy while implied in monarchy. Surely, one could argue, an ideal constitution of society should include such a thing, a Pontifex Maximus. Needless to mention, further discussion on this topic yields many aphorisms. Back to the historical narrative. Herodotus describes who were the Greek allies at Salamis, chastises those that were absent, and gives a brief history of the races or groups that inhabited the Peloponnesus. Subsequently, the historian describes how, since the Greeks were once again clamoring to leave the island, Themistocles devised a trick, a deceitful plan, to force the fight. He told Sikinos, a slave whom he later not only freed but made wealthy, to pretend defecting and misadvise Xerxes that if he did not attack now, he would lose his chance as the Greeks were preparing to sail away. The Persians, therefore, landed a large force in the small island of Thaleia. This one was situated between Salamis and the mainland, and it is the one that Aristides is tasked with capturing and using as a treasury to guard the loot gained from the battle. I hoped that Herodotus would say much about Aristides, but he only says that he was reputed to be
the best and most upright of all Athenians.
Of course, the writer does point out that the great man had been ostracized from Athens, and that he was Themistocles' political opponent. Despite their political differences, however, Aristides offers to help ensure the success of Themistocles' plan. He is the one that convinces the other Greek commanders that the Persians are arraying for battle and have closed all possible path of retreat. I should mention that surprisingly little about the battle is described. The Athenians combated against the Phoenicians, the best of the enemy sailors. The Spartans fought the Greeks Ionians serving under Persia. Some of these did refuse to fight as Themistocles had hoped. Concerning the warrior queen Artemisia, it should be understood that Herodotus is from Halicarnassus, the city of this now most famous queen. Thus, perhaps, there is an unavoidable bias. He has it that she fought most bravely and only avoided capture by pretending to be Greek. Praising her, Xerxes famously proclaimed,
"My men have become women, and my women men."
The barbarians' casualties were atrocious because most did not know how to swim. It is to be expected as they were conscripted against their will. I feel sorry for them. As for Aristides, his exile or ostracism is revoked, and after the battle he returns to Athens. I should mention, unlike Themistocles, he died poor as he never cared for wealth. Not that Themistocles died in a very nice fashion at all. Despite their differences, both are worthy of admiration. Herodotus also makes a special note, in adulation, of the mailing system that the Persians had constructed. It was a horseman relay system. With it, Xerxes sent a message of the defeat to Susa. Herodotus describes the wallowing that the barbarians fell into. You may experience it nearly firsthand from Aeschylus' play, The Persians. I will end this video here. The next section of Book 8 includes a criticism of slavery, many psychological observations, and Xerxes' retreat.
Since learning is safer than discovery, learners may be evolutionarily successful, but explorers are ever an aberration.
The 8th book, called Urania, Part 2 of 2, Xerxes flees. In the first part of this book, the Greek allies crushed the Persian navy on a battle adjacent to the island of Salamis. Uncertain of how to deal with the defeat, Xerxes, the Persian king, asked Artemisia to give him advice. You will remember that Artemisia was the warrior queen from Halicarnassus. She told him that he should flee. She said that he could take solace in the fact that he had burned Athens. On Xerxes' satisfaction with her advice, the writer makes the most astute psychological observation. Consider the lines.
With this advice, Xerxes was greatly delighted, since she succeeded in saying that very thing which he himself was meaning to do. For not even if all the men and all the women in the world had been counseling him to remain, would he have done so, as I think. So much had he been struck with terror.
Alas, says I, it is likewise with most humans' introspections and analyses. To most people, the correct coincides with the self-pleasing. The historian also describes how all in Xerxes' entourage were afraid of the king's reaction or repercussion, especially Mardonius. He was the hawkish general that had not only insisted on invading Greece, but also on fighting the naval battle. As such, Mardonius asked the king permission to stay in Greece for the purpose of continuing the land campaign with the elite corps of the Persian army. Xerxes agreed, perhaps happy to be rid of Mardonius' unproductive haughtiness. He allowed him 30,000 soldiers. By the way, Mardonios was quick to lay blame on the Phoenicians and Egyptians, rather than on himself or the Persians. Herodotus then makes a most harrowing digression that is tangential to a renunciation of slavery. He tells of a certain man named Hermodomos who,
of all persons whom we know up to this time, obtained the greatest revenge for a wrong done to him.
This man was captured as a young boy, made into a eunuch, and sold as a slave to the Persians. Horrible fate, except for the fact that he grew up as a favorite of the royal court and thus traveled with the army during their invasion of Greece. Here, he found the man that mutilated him. He pretended amiability towards the culprit, telling him about all the good that had come to him, and invited the man, with his family, to dine. The man believed him, or felt compelled, and at dinner he, the eunuch, changed his demeanor and forced the man to do the surgery to his own children. Not satisfied, the eunuch then had the children do the surgery to their own father. Herodotus' methodology is filled with such socio-cultural accounts. Things such as this story are far from mere trivia. They fall in line with his intent to mention the small and the large, given as all things change. Okay, back to the narrative. The Greeks debate whether they should close Xerxes' retreat. Eurybiades, the Spartan commander-in-chief, is against it. Agreeing with the Spartan, Themistocles, the great Athenian that Plutarch includes in his biographies, is quoted telling the Athenian people,
I myself also have been present before now on many occasions, and have heard of many more, on which something of this kind came to pass, namely that men who were forced into great straits, after they had been defeated fought again, and repaired their former disaster.
I should mention that, once the forces of Mardonios were destroyed, and the devastation they wrought was repaired, the Spartan general argued that the combined Greeks should go on the offensive and conquer the Persian Empire. Of course, this is what all philosophers always counseled. As Xenophon describes, it was attempted by a Spartan, but as Diodorus Siculus relates, it would be a Macedonian that accomplishes it. Moving away from socio-cultural remarks, Herodotus now makes some political insinuations. He says that Themistocles sent message to Xerxes warning him that the allies intended to destroy the bridge across the Hellespont. The historian believes he did this so as to buy favor with the Persians in the expectation that he might need their safety in the future, which of course, he did. Yes, later Themistocles is ostracized and ends up living under the tutelage of Xerxes. Yet, as Plutarch points out, he never waged war against the Greeks and instead killed himself when such a time arose. Nonetheless, the present historian says,
Themistocles then speaking thus endeavored to deceive them, and the Athenians followed his advice. For he had had the reputation even in former times of being a man of ability, and he had now proved himself to be in truth both able and of good judgment. Therefore they were ready in every way to follow his advice when he spoke.
As such, Herodotus demonstrates his politics. He does not like Themistocles. It is hard to envision what about him he may not have liked. It is possible that Herodotus is simply playing the audience, meaning he might simply be writing what he expects most readers wish to read. Anything is possible. Either way, let me point out that telling the Persians about the Greeks' plan was possibly a good thing. After all, wishing for Xerxes to flee, giving him such a warning amounted to showing him the open door. Aside from the aforementioned, Herodotus also relates how Themistocles insisted that the Athenians tax another city. As such, he started the practice of foreign taxation. I should note, for it is jocular, Themistocles told the men of Andrus that Athens had the divinities called persuasion and compulsion to make them pay, and cleverly the men of Andrus replied that since they had those of poverty and helplessness they could not. Be it as it may have been, the Athenian Empire is definitively uncommendable. Not that such a practice should be laid on democracy, rather culture, time period, and in part the Athenian allies themselves. This is best understood analyzing Thucydides' history of the Pan-Hellenic War. Herodotus describes Xerxes' march back and how Mardonios decided to make camp in Thessaly. The Persian general aimed to retake Athens after the winter. As for Xerxes' march, it was horrible. The barbarian army was not only struck with famine, but also plague. There is a digression about a Thracian king that literally blinds his own children as punishment for having joined the Persian force. Oh yeah, there is a possible account wherein Xerxes himself tried to sail, rather than march, back to Persia. In this voyage, if it truly happened, a storm struck wherein Xerxes asked the sailors to jump overboard so as to lighten the load. The historian doubts the story, but it is emblematic of tyranny. The narrative then turns back to Themistocles. He was voted as second greatest by all the commanders. Yet, since all voted for themselves as first, technically none won the vote. LOL. Nonetheless, the Athenian was regarded as being the best or most useful, the MVP. He was given honors in Sparta and at the Olympic Games. Jocular how, when a political opponent accused him of only being famous because of Athens, he replied,
I tell thee thus it is, if I had been a native of Belbina, I should never have been thus honored by the Spartans, but neither wouldest thou, my friend, for all that thou art an Athenian.
To end this account, there is the story of a certain Alexander, king of the then subjected Macedonians. Herodotus relates the mythical story of how Macedonia was founded. Skipping over that, the historical narrative regards Mardonio's hope of allying with the Athenians. Yes, he hoped that with their navy he could conquer all of Greece, and in exchange the Athenians would be left as the governors. The previously mentioned Alexander was sent to convey this offer to the Athenians. The Spartans worried, not the least because an oracle had once prophesied that if the Athenians united with the Medes, then Sparta would be conquered. Thus, they offered the Athenians all the friendship and aid in rebuilding what they could, adding,
You know that in Barbarians there is neither faith nor truth at all.
Meaning, you cannot trust any deal with the likes of Mardonios. The Athenians in turn replied that the Spartans should not worry as,
So long as the sun goes on the same course by which he goes now, we will never make an agreement with Xerxes. But we will go forth to defend ourselves against him, trusting in the gods and the heroes as allies, for whom he had no respect when he set fire to their houses and to their sacred images.
Let me also quote part of what they sent to Mardonios in reply.
We must necessarily avenge to the very utmost rather than make an agreement with him who did these deeds. Then secondly there is the bond of Hellenic race, by which we are of one blood and of one speech, the common temples of the gods and the common sacrifices, the manners of life which are the same for all.
You got to love it. Though, alas, the subsequent Pan-Hellenic War is essentially proof or sign that even if the likes of belligerent and ugly extraterrestrial aliens showed up, humanity would nonetheless not unify. There is only one book remaining in Herodotus' Histories, if you wish to know how the Athenians and the Spartans defeated Mardonius Persians. Watch the next videos. If you do not know how we got to this point, you really should not miss all the prior. Now, to pique your curiosity, to motivate you to watch the last video of the series, I gift you a teaser sample of one of the many aphorisms I crafted as I read this author.
The epitome of foolishness is never considering death. Disagreement between democracies is worse than even a bad agreement.
The 9th book, called Calliope, The Final Victory. You must recall that the prior book ended with the Athenians firmly rejecting Mardonio's alliance proposal. Also, I should remind you, Mardonios was the hawkish, glory-hungry general that stayed in Greece after Xerxes, the king, fled back to Persia. At this moment, Herodotus describes the Thebans as perfectly willing traitors to the Greek cause. Speaking to Mardonios,
They urged him not to advance further, but to sit down there and endeavor to subdue to himself the whole of Hellas without fighting. Send money to the men who have power in their cities, and thus sending thou wilt divide Hellas into two parties.
Of course, the prior describes what later became the Persian strategy. Luckily, for the time being, Mardonios did not follow the Thebans' counsel. He captures Athens for a second time. Like before, he did not have to fight for it. All the Athenians had once again left toward Salamis. Curiously, a certain man named Lycidas suggested that they should accept Mardonio's alliance. In response, the men of Athens stoned Lycidas to death, and later, when the women heard about it, they themselves went to his family and killed his wife. Yikes! Remember that this was the second time in less than 12 months that they were made refugees. I think it is understandable that they be angry. Herodotus, in turn, is very critical of the Spartans and the Lacedaemonians in general. He says that they grew confident and secure because the wall across the Corinthian isthmus was near completed. The Athenians, therefore, were the ones that had to send messengers to them. He quotes them speaking to the Ephors.
As for you, after having come then to great dread lest we should make a treaty with the Persians, so soon as ye learnt certainly what our spirit was, namely that we should never betray Hellas, and because your wall across the isthmus is all but finished, now ye make no account of the Athenians. For the present then the Athenians have anger against you.
In return, the Spartan council debated until a foreigner, a Tegean, a man named Clios who held high repute among them, said,
If the Athenians are not friendly with us but are allies of the barbarian, then though a strong wall may have been built across the isthmus, yet a wide door has been opened for the Persians into Peloponnesus.
The Ephors agreed and sent their army commanded by Pausanias. The Argives warned Mardonios of the coming force, and he retreated as Attica lacked ideal ground for his horsemen. Once in Boeotia, near Thebes, the Persian commander disrespectfully cut down most of their fruit trees for the purpose of making a defensive fortification. Subsequently, some Thebans invited Mardonios and many of his associates to a feast and party. Once there, one of the Persians said to a Greek,
Dost thou see these Persians who are feasting here, and the army which we left behind encamped upon the river? Of all these, when a little time has gone by, thou shalt see but very few surviving.
The Greek told the Persian that he should share his worries with Mardonios, and the Persian replied,
The most hateful grief of all human grief is this, to have knowledge of the truth but no power over the event.
At the end of the video, I will show an aphorism I crafted from the sentence. Before the final battle, there is a heated skirmish as the Persians, the proper Persians, attacked a Greek position. They did so on horseback using bows and javelins. They repeatedly attacked and retreated until their captain, a man named Mecistios, was killed. As a result, they attacked in full force, trying to recover his body. Regardless, the body of the captain remained with the Greeks, and later they
put the dead body in a cart and conveyed it along their ranks. And the body was a sight worth seeing for its size and beauty. Wherefore also the men left their places in the ranks and went one after the other to gaze upon Mecistios.
That is some Iliad stuff right there. LOL. For the final battle, it was assumed that the Spartans would command one of the flanks. However, there was a dispute between the Tegeans and the Athenians over who would command the other flank. The Tegeans argued that they had a historical, mythical precedent. Their claim had to do with Heracles, and it was common practice for them to hold the other flank when fighting in alliance with the Spartans. They ended their argument by saying,
Therefore it is just that we have the other wing rather than the Athenians, for they have not achieved deeds such as ours, either new or old.
The Athenians in turn spoke of how they, with Theseus as king, had helped the children of Heracles and how they had combated the Amazonians. A surviving play of Euripides tells part of the story. You may also learn about it on this channel. Either way, they ended their argument with,
Let it suffice about ancient deeds, even by reason of the deed wrought at Marathon alone we are worthy to have this privilege and others besides this, seeing that we are long of all the Hellenes fought in single combat with the Persians.
In the end, both sides let the Spartans choose, and these choose in favor of the Athenians. By the way, Aristides, Plutarch's great and noble, was given command of the Athenian flank. The total number of the Greek force was 38,700 hoplites, along with 69,500 light-armed men. Most of the light-armed men were Spartans. The historian has it that these were Helots. Such a thing would fly in the face of conventional knowledge about the Helots. Surely, they were not arming their slaves, thus. What Helots were these? I guess there are various possibilities about it. As for the combined force of the barbarians, It was around 30,000 men of various armors and weapons alongside the Greeks that fought with them. The historian says that he does not know how many Greeks they were, but he estimates around 5,000 hoplites. The Spartans tell the Athenians that they, the Athenians, should be the ones facing the Persian soldiers as they had already defeated them in the Battle of Marathon. The Athenians are glad at the proposal and say that they had considered such a thing but had not proposed it for fear of insulting the Spartans. Thus, the two change sides in the battle line so that Athenians will be against the Persians and the Spartans against the opposing Greeks. Yet, Mardonios, believing his Persians are superior and wishing to fight against the famed Spartans, also switches sides. This side switching then occurs and reoccurs until Mardonios sends a herald to the Spartans saying,
Ye covered with fear, now therefore since ye were not the first to say this, we are the first, why do we not forthwith fight, ye on behalf of the Hellenes, since ye have the reputation of being the best, and we on behalf of the barbarians, with equal numbers on both sides. Whichsoever of us shall be the victors, let these be counted as victorious with their whole army.
The Spartans decline and Mardonios, feeling confident due to the Spartans' refusal, attacks. The Persians were on horseback, and thus some of them were able to bypass the Spartan position and choke up the well from which the allied army was drawing water. As a result, after a day of inconclusive fighting and skirmishing, the allies are forced to withdraw. Yet, a Spartan captain refuses to do so, claiming that doing so would be dishonorable. To make a long story short, the allied army accidentally divides, and the Spartans are therefore separated from the rest. Pausanias calls for Athenian aid, but they're blocked by an enemy division. Basically, the battle is fought in various places, not in a single location, and it is rather disordered. Regardless, of course, the Persians are defeated handedly by the Spartans. Herodotus provides the more obvious explanation.
Now in courage and in strength, the Persians were not inferior to the others, but they were without defensive armor, and moreover they were unversed in war and unequal to their opponents in skill. And they would dart out one at a time, or in groups of about 10 together, some more and some less, and fall upon the Spartans and perish. Their manner of dress, without defensive armor, was a very great cause of destruction to them, since in truth they were contending light-armed against hoplites.
Yes, the fight was certainly light-armed, inexperienced, mainly forced, fighting against free, willing, heavily armed, and outstandingly trained men. That having been said, it should be kept in mind that the barbarian commanders, as all barbarian commanders, were aristocrats that either inherited their position, or were chosen by a man that in turn had merely inherited his position. The Greeks, on the other hand, were serving under elected commanders. That too makes all the difference in the world. Either way, Herodotus calls Pausanias the victor of the most famous battle ever. On top of that, he indicates, and later we'll return to this point, that divinity might have played a role. Speaking of the goddess Demeter, he says,
I suppose, if one ought to suppose anything about divine things, that the goddess herself refused to receive them because they had set fire to her temple, that is to say the palace at Eleusis.
To be clear, for some unexplained reason the fleeing barbarians could not find the religious sanctuary where they would have been granted safety, LOL. Whereas the Spartans fought against the Persians and killed Mardonios, the Athenians fought against the Theban hoplites. Once they fled, the Thebans did not go with the rest of the barbarian army, rather they went directly to Thebes. The allies then began the job of breaching and capturing the defensive position that Mardonios had previously built. This was easy as the Athenians had plenty of experience attacking such fortifications. Either way, while the allies lost in total less than 200 men, the barbarians lost almost all 30,000. Subsequently, the historian describes at length how the remaining Persians were mopped up. Curiously, he says that the Spartan helots stole much of the loot, and excessive loot. He says that
the great wealth of the Aeginetans first came from this, that they bought the gold from the helots, making pretense that it was brass.
That is, gold that the Helots managed to steal from the loot. Another noteworthy thing is a remark by Pausanias. He assembled a dish of the Persians, using the captured loot, placed this lavish dinner beside the typical Spartan meal, and gathered the Greek commanders to show them.
I desired to show you the senselessness of this leader of the Medes, who having such fare as this, came to us who have such sorry fare as ye see here, in order to take it away from us.
Curiously, the body of Mardonios was lost, though Pausanias did not intend to do anything bad to it. Also, over time, many Greek cities that did not fight at the battle made their own fake funeral mounds. Meaning, they made mounds of earth without any bodies as if pretending to future generations that they too had fought for the liberation of all Greece. LOL. It is understandable. Then enters the story of the Thebans that fought against the Allies. The Allies besieged the city and drove it to famine. Eventually, the Thebans agreed to turn over the men that had fought against the Allies, and Pausanias had them executed without any trial. As for what was happening at sea while the Battle of Plataea was fought, the Athenians, along with others, chased the remnants of the Persian fleet. The Persians, in turn, abandoned their ships and sought security in a land battle. The Greek commander, the other Spartan king named Leotychides, sailed close to the barbarian force and shouted out loud as if he were sharing a plan with the Greeks serving under Persia. The writer explains that
The design in this act was the same as that of Themistocles at Athens, for it was meant that either the words uttered should escape the knowledge of the barbarians and persuade the Ionians, or that they should be reported to the barbarians and make them distrustful of the Hellenes.
before this fight, news arrived to both armies that the Greeks were utterly victorious at Plataea. As such, the barbarians lost their courage, were defeated, and few managed to flee. The historian finds it remarkable that both fights took place near a temple to Demeter. Thus, he insinuates divine aid took place in the fight. Also, jocularly, he has it that both battles took place on the same day. Of this front, a debate ensues as to whether they should leave the Greeks in their islands or transport them to occupy the lands of those that had joined forces with the Persians. The Spartans wanted to begin moving the whole of the population. They were afraid that they could not protect them in case of a future Persian attack. Yet, the Athenians refused. As a result, the Samians, Chians, Lesbians, and other islanders were simply included into the Greek Defensive League. I should mention, on this channel you may also learn about the writings of people such as Sappho, the poetess, the 10th Muse, that lived in the island of Lesbos. After this battle, the Spartan king sailed his men back, and the Athenians instead directed themselves to the Hellespont. Here they besieged a city and captured part of Xerxes' army. In the end, they brought back many spoils and pieces of the rope which was used to create the bridge across the continents. Finally, to end the book, all the prior segues into a story about Cyrus. You will remember that he was the first Persian king described in the first chapter of Herodotus' Histories. In this story, a man tells Cyrus that they should move the Persians to better, more fruitful land. Cyrus replies,
From lands which are not rugged, men who are not rugged are apt to come forth, since it does not belong to the same land to bring forth fruits of the earth which are admirable, and also men who are good in war.
Herodotus literally ends his book with this notion. I find it a bit surprising. Perhaps he did not mean this to be the last book. Perhaps it is a reference to the Athenian lack of fertile soil. Either way, this is the conclusion.
Although some knowledge yields power, and some knowledge requires power to be known, most knowledge only lets you know how powerless you are.
If you enjoy or gain from my aphorisms, know that I have thousands. I will be writing books with short thematic essays composed out of aphorisms. These essays are profound and intriguing yet easy to read. For very cheap copies, look up Protagoras Pause in the Amazon website. I repeat, Protagoras Pause, that's my name.